The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. And good morning, and thank you all for joining our hearing today entitled, America Leads the Way, Our History as the Global Leader at Reducing Emissions. I am excited for this opportunity to highlight America's global leadership and success in both emission reductions and energy production. I also look forward to discussing how we can build off this success to expand our leadership around the world. The United States is the country it is today, not because of heavy-handed regulatory policies that have driven industries out of business and manufacturing overseas, but because of the nation's longstanding entrepreneurial culture that has provided the freedom and flexibility for businesses to deploy innovative technologies across our energy and industrial economy. As our economy continues to grow and our energy demand and use increase, our environmental stewardship continues to improve as well. In fact, the EPA has air quality data showing that as of 2022, the total emissions of the 6 major air pollutants have dropped by 73% since 1980. I can remember when it was 68% just a few years ago. So we've already done 5% better just in the last few years. During this same period, gross domestic product increased 196%. Vehicle miles traveled increased 108%. Energy consumption increased 29%. And the U.S. population grew by 47%. Why is this important? It shows that becoming more prosperous and secure as a nation is possible while also decreasing emissions. We've proven it, we've done it. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In fact, during this time, America has flexed its muscles as a global energy production superpower. The American shale revolution is a prime example of this entrepreneurial spirit. Pro-growth energy policies have taken U.S. energy dominance to new levels. Innovation in the energy sector has increased the standard of living for many Americans by boosting productivity, reducing energy prices, and cutting emissions. It is estimated that the shale revolution saved U.S. consumers $203 billion annually, breaking down to $2,500 per family of 4. It also lowered energy-related greenhouse gas emissions by 527 metric tons per year. I saw the benefits of the shale revolution firsthand. My district sits on top of the Utica and Marcellus shale regions. Eastern and southeastern Ohio have helped the United States become the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas. The shale revolution not only made American energy dominant, but it also provided America with geopolitical advantages and the ability to export clean energy to our allies across the globe, what we would call the U.S. LNG revolution. H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act, has passed twice on the House floor now because it recognizes the successes of the past and further built on those successes to unleash American energy. My bill, which was included as part of H.R. 1, lifted all restrictions on the import and export of natural gas. It's a proven fact that American LNG exports reduce carbon emissions by replacing huge quantities of dirtier fuels harvested overseas. Despite this fact, the Biden administration and the environmental left aren't interested in this progress. Why? Because increasing LNG exports, which we can do easily with our vast quantities of natural gas, would not, and I repeat, would not require a radical reordering of American society and a reduced standard of living for the people that we call citizens here, because that's the true goal of this radical climate agenda. It's a missed opportunity not to exploit America's vast reserves of cleaner energy resources. The Biden administration's, quote, whole of government climate agenda, forcing rapid vehicle electrification and renewable energy, will only serve to move our energy industry and other American industries overseas, strengthening adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran. Friends, we should not apologize for America's prosperity. Instead, let's recognize the progress we as a nation have made in both environmental stewardship and energy leadership. And with that, my time has expired, and I'm going to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko from New York, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. We appreciate your time and your input. America has made undeniable progress in reducing air pollution. This should be celebrated. The Clean Air Act is an incredible success story. But as the 28th UN Climate Change Conference of Parties begins, today's hearing should be an opportunity to be clear-eyed about what we have achieved, how we have achieved it, and how much more work is left to be done. Because there are still big challenges. For example, despite a 78% reduction in criteria pollutants since the enactment of the Clean Air Act, according to the American Lung Association's 2023 State of the Air report, nearly 36% of Americans, almost 120 million people, live in places with failing grades for unhealthy levels of ozone or particle pollution. And we know there is a similar story for climate pollution. There is a clear scientific consensus about the threat of unmitigated climate change, and we are already experiencing environmental, public health, economic, and national security impacts from it. To avoid the worst consequences of climate change and stay well below a 2-degree global temperature increase, as agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, the United States must do its part by achieving net zero emissions around mid-century. Yes, there has been a 17% reduction of domestic greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 to 2021, but this has generally been the easiest 17%. It is obvious that we require much deeper and more rapid decarbonization than what has been achieved since 2005. The good news is more progress will likely be achieved in the near term thanks to the work led by Democrats to enact the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which are supporting clean energy technology deployment and manufacturing all across our country. And while these incentives are important, innovation is often not possible without a mix of carrots and sticks. Air quality improvements brought about by the development of pollution control technologies and less polluting alternatives can often be directly traced back to EPA regulatory actions. Does anyone honestly believe that major reductions in tailpipe pollution would have happened absent regulations? Or that the progress we have made to reduce particulate matter and ozone were not in large part a result of the NAAQS? Or that EPA's acid rain program was not a factor in reducing sulfur dioxide? There are countless examples of EPA rules playing a driving factor in emissions reductions. Another recent example has been the AIM Act to phase down the production and use of superpolluting hydrofluorocarbons. American chemical and equipment manufacturers recognized that the United States could be the global leader in the next generation of less polluting alternatives to HFCs. And these entities wanted regulatory certainty to make that transition happen in an orderly manner. The AIM Act is proof that Democrats and Republicans and industry and environmentalists can still come together to support a flexible but also ambitious regulatory framework that will guarantee major air pollution reductions while spurring innovation and creating American jobs. So there's no reason why we cannot do the same for other pollutants, including carbon dioxide. Finally, I appreciate the majority's hearing memo's acknowledgement that many American industries are cleaner than their foreign competitors. Thanks to efforts by congressional Democrats and the Biden administration, we are ushering in a manufacturing renaissance, which will build American supply chains for the key strategic industries that will be part of the global clean energy transition. We are set to witness major growth in energy-intensive industries, such as direct air capture, electrolytic hydrogen production, data center operations, and semiconductor, EV, and battery manufacturing. We must support these emerging industries in their efforts to produce the most climate-friendly version of their products. If U.S.-made goods have lower embodied carbon, we should recognize and promote that. This committee could play its part in expanding buy clean procurement policies and understanding the issues around carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Smart climate policies can and should be designed to promote the competitiveness of U.S. energy-intensive industries, ensuring that American manufacturers play a critical role in the global transition to a cleaner economy. So, Mr. Chair, while I certainly appreciate us taking the opportunity to celebrate America's successful environmental laws, we would be remiss if we believe the job is done. I hope we can work together to help chart a course to achieve further pollution reductions. With that, I thank you and yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Today's hearing is an opportunity to celebrate American energy and environmental leadership. We're going to explore our legacy as technological innovators to solve tough problems around energy and environmental protection without sacrificing our economic development or national security. This is the message that Energy and Commerce plans to celebrate on the world stage at COP28. For decades, America has led the way. We've harnessed the power of nuclear energy, electrified millions of rural American homes with clean hydropower, and ushered in the shale revolution, which continues to create millions of new jobs, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and revitalize communities across the country. America is more energy secure today than ever before, and it's thanks to this legacy, which was built on the foundation of free markets, entrepreneurship, and giving people the opportunity to choose which energy sources best suit their needs. Today, we are the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. We've become the top energy exporter, which is helping to shift markets and bolster our security against countries like Russia and Iran. This shale revolution and the affordable and reliable natural gas that American workers are now producing has also enabled America to reduce emissions more than any other nation in the world. And we've had the capacity to continue helping countries reduce their emissions even further. American energy leadership is critical to ensuring we're not reliant on China, a country that maintains some of the worst environmental and labor standards in the world. It is clear by their actions that China does not share our concerns about climate change risk, nor our value of environmental stewardship. For instance, China-related emissions of CO2 increased by almost 80% between 2005 and 2021. They're responsible for 28% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, making them the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases by far. And this is more than GHG emissions of the entire developed world combined. In the US, on the other hand, CO2 emissions from energy sector have declined by 14.5% just since 2007. Since 2005, US CO2 emissions from the electric sector alone have declined by more than 28%. Between 1970 and 2020, the US reduced emissions for criteria air pollutants by 78%. And since 2000, fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, air quality has improved 44%. All told, US air quality is the best in the world, and it's getting cleaner. Furthermore, China's supply chains, which rely on slave labor, control the vast majority of critical mineral processing and refining for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels. Moving to 100% wind, solar, and battery-powered energy, as some have proposed, will cede our energy future to China and could have perverse effects on increasing emissions. We should instead be working to build on our remarkable legacy, which has transformed the human condition, helped lift people out of poverty, and raise the standard of living. The best way to do that is with a strong energy mix that takes advantage of the resources we have here at home, lower costs for Americans, and prevents us from becoming more reliant on China for our energy needs. Intermittent renewable sources like wind and solar have a place in this mix, but they need dispatchable energy like clean natural gas, nuclear, hydropower to back them up. By standing up for American values of free market competition, innovation, and environmental stewardship, we can continue building on this legacy. Excuse me, which will drive down emissions and make our energy affordable and reliable. These are achievable, bipartisan goals that will help us beat China and our foreign adversaries. This is the best path. Rather than the market-distorting subsidies and grants for, quote, green technologies, which some have suggested, or the punitive environmental restrictions that force mining and manufacturing out of the U.S., while banning people from using gas-powered cars and natural gas appliances. This forced transition will leave our economy dangerously dependent upon supply chains from China and make energy less affordable, less reliable for Americans. With the right policies in place, however, America can lead the way in energy expansion and the transformation of our energy mix. Our economy, our national security, and the stability of global markets and the environment will only benefit from continued American leadership. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Today, we'll examine America's leadership in combating the worsening climate crisis as we head into the 28th UN Climate Summit, known as COP28. And we need to demonstrate our nation's commitment to standing with our allies in the fight against climate change. After all, we're out of time for denialism and obstruction. The science on climate change is indisputable. Earlier this month, the 5th National Climate Assessment underscored the need for urgent action to combat this threat. And while the United States has taken steps to dramatically cut greenhouse gas emissions, more action is needed now to avoid the most catastrophic consequences associated with climate change. We can and must protect our communities from the devastating impacts of the climate crisis while growing our economy and cutting costs for consumers as we lead the way in the global clean energy transition. Yet time and again, House Republicans have prioritized their polluters over people agenda. They've tried to undermine and repeal critical climate programs established in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, despite these programs helping communities in their districts. And Republicans have also attacked the Biden administration for proposing regulations to address carbon pollution from the oil and gas industry, power plants, and vehicles. And while Republicans tout an all-of-the-above energy approach, they continue to push back against policies that accelerate clean energy development and reduce emissions. So I think it's time for my Republican colleagues to change course because their polluters over people agenda is costing taxpayer dollars and lives. Our nation now experiences an extreme weather event with damages over $1 billion once every 3 weeks. These events are deadly and they are destroying homes and livelihoods. Now, COP28 provides an opportunity for the United States to demonstrate climate leadership on the international stage. Climate change is a global problem, and that means we need both domestic solutions and international cooperation. This year, countries will participate in the first global stock take, the most extensive assessment of global climate action. This will help inform future commitments by parties to the convention, including India, Russia, and China. America's participation in COP is essential if we're to hold nations accountable to their Paris commitments while driving more ambitious actions moving forward. The Biden administration has already displayed climate leadership in preparation for this year's conference. China and the United States recently agreed to set reduction targets for all greenhouse gases, marking the first time that China has committed to addressing superpollutants like methane and hydrofluorocarbons. And this is critical since China is the world's largest methane emitter. Democrats understand the seriousness and urgency of the climate crisis. That's why we passed historic climate legislation last Congress. These policies are already creating new jobs, cutting costs for working families, and advancing homegrown clean energy, all while tackling the climate crisis. The down payment in these laws, along with the strong regulatory framework proposed by the Biden administration, will complement our nation's international efforts. We simply must use every tool in our toolbox if we're going to stop the worst-case climate scenario. And many states, local governments, and individual businesses are already moving forward to reduce emissions. It's imperative that the federal government lead the charge and help them in these efforts and spur further action in communities across the country. We must discuss ways to help communities better adapt to the changes that we're already seeing. We need to modernize and upgrade our infrastructure to ensure vital services like water, sewer, electricity, telecommunications, and transportation are more resilient. And this important work will make our communities safer and better prepared for extreme weather events and will provide good-paying jobs and the modern, flexible infrastructure that will help us grow our economy for the future. So as we move forward, we would hope that this is a bipartisan effort. We join as partners amongst Democrats and Republicans to address climate change and take climate actions because, after all, the worsening climate crisis affects all of us. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back and will now introduce our witnesses for today. Thank you all, by the way, for being here. First, we have the Honorable Mark Menezes. Mark is the President and CEO of the United States Energy Association. Miss Amanda Eversole, the Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy Officer of the American Petroleum Institute. Mr. Karl Hausker, Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, and Mr. Mark Mills, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Mr. Menezes, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chair Johnson, Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Tonko, Ranking Member Pallone, all members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am Mark Menezes, President and CEO of the United States Energy Association. USEA, a nonprofit educational organization, fosters the advancement of U.S. technology and know-how in the United States and in the developing countries in partnership with USAID, the State Department, and DOE. Throughout the world, we develop clean, sustainable, cyber-secure energy, integrated energy systems, and create environments for private investment. In the U.S., USEA works with communities and Native American tribes to deploy efficient, cost-effective energy and carbon management technologies. Now, to achieve these missions, 2 lessons have been learned. 1, successful, lasting projects were built from the ground up, not top-down, with community involvement and acceptance. And 2, capacity building is necessary to ensure the continued operations and maintenance of energy systems. Our EPC board members say it will take time to build out the energy infrastructure to meet net zero goals. Whether solar or wind farms or new hydrogen facilities, it takes time to design, permit, and construct these projects. It requires permitting process improvements and an increase in the supply of qualified workers, engineers, critical materials, and supply chains necessary for emission-reducing projects. As has been said, the U.S. continues to be a world leader in emission reductions. EPA reports U.S. net greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 17% and CO2 emissions by 18% since 2005. Now, importantly, by 2030, EIA forecasts that U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions will decrease in the range of 25 to 45% below the 2005 levels, depending on low or high economic growth. EIA attributes these decreases to increased electrification, equipment efficiency, and renewable electricity. All will require deployment of U.S. technology. It was the U.S. innovation that drove the shale revolution, and it will be the U.S. innovation that drives deployment of emission-reducing technologies. U.S. solar companies are producing new solar panels and components more efficiently, cheaper, safer, and more environmentally friendly than the crystalline silicon photovoltaic imports we rely on today. Our long-duration battery manufacturers have developed technologies free of the critical minerals and materials required for lithium-ion batteries. These batteries are water-based, safe, 100% recyclable with low carbon production. Advanced small modular nuclear reactors, like high-temperature gas reactors, fluoride salt-cooled high-temperature reactors, and molten salt fast reactors are being developed for deployment. Wind companies have improved energy output and are developing lighter rotor blades and high-performance optimizing control systems to increase production and decrease capacity factors. U.S. companies are advancing commercial deployment of CCUS technologies to better detect, measure, and reduce methane emissions. Our natural gas companies produce the most environmentally compliant natural gas in the world and seek to develop differentiated gas markets. Pipeline companies, utilities, and distribution companies are developing ways to increase hydrogen use. Traditional hydrogen and industrial gas producers are bringing their expertise to use hydrogen as an energy source. Finally, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, as we look toward COP28, the committee should be aware of the international forecast for future energy use, those from the EIA, OPEC, and the IEA. The EIA forecasts growth of renewables, increased electricity demand, Yet, the continued use of fossil, mainly natural gas, in the countries that will experience increased populations, Southeast Asia, Africa, India. These increasing populations and income levels will offset the effects of both energy efficiency gains and emission reductions. OPEC forecasts an increased use of oil from today's demand of approximately 100 million barrels per day to 116 due to projected increases in global population and economic growth. IEA's net zero roadmap takes a different approach. It assesses what must happen to meet net zero goals by 2050, not what current trends forecast. Reducing meat consumption, adopting more energy-efficient practices, and changing transportation habits will help the world's demand for oil to peak this decade due to the rapid adoption of electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and more cleaner and renewable energy resources. Whatever the path, Mr. Chairman, USEA will be part of ensuring U.S. technologies and know-how will lead the way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions, and I ask that my written statement be included in the record. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and now Ms. Eversole will go to you for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Amanda Eversole, and I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy Officer of the American Petroleum Institute. API represents all segments of America's oil and natural gas industry. Our approximately 600 members, from large integrated companies to small independent operators, support nearly 11 million jobs across all 50 states. The subject of today's hearing, highlighting America's leadership in reducing global emissions, is an important topic and one that should be celebrated. America has led the world in reducing CO2 emissions over the past 2 decades, even as our industry has made the United States the world's #1 producer of oil and natural gas. The air Americans breathe is cleaner because of innovative improvements to the way energy is produced, transported, refined, and consumed. These improvements have driven significant declines in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as criteria pollutants. We are also tackling the methane challenge head-on. Yet, we are at a crossroads, and how we work together going forward will determine our energy future. Today, I'm going to talk about how our industry has done 3 things: decreased emissions while meeting the energy trilemma, increased innovation, and advanced America's national security. First, since 2005, the United States has reduced CO2 emissions more than any other country in the world. Industry employees go to work every day to meet the energy trilemma. That means the need for energy that is affordable, reliable, and cleaner. While many insist that energy demand is declining, the International Energy Agency actually expects new record demand for oil and natural gas in the coming years, as the global population surges to nearly 10 billion people by 2050. My second point is that innovation is core to our success. It wasn't long ago that energy scarcity dominated the debate. Yet something happened in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Texas, North Dakota, New Mexico, Colorado, and so many other places that dramatically altered this trajectory. Industry innovation, modern horizontal drilling, and hydraulic fracturing launched the shale revolution that transformed America's energy future. We stopped talking about scarcity and ushered in an era of energy abundance and new possibility for us and for our allies. As a result, U.S. oil and natural gas production have surged to new records of 13.2 million barrels per day and 100 billion cubic feet per day, respectively. We were previously one of the world's largest energy importers, and we are now one of the world's largest energy exporters, a reversal that comes with enormous benefits, notably the increased American energy production that happened in conjunction with environmental stewardship. Over the past decade, methane intensity of oil and gas produced in the 7 major U.S. basins has fallen by 66%, and that's primarily due to industry-led efforts like API's environmental partnership. There are other success stories everywhere you look. CO2 emissions from the domestic power sector have fallen to their lowest levels since the 1980s. World-class innovation and standards have resulted in U.S. Gulf of Mexico oil production ranked among the lowest globally for CO2 intensity, and cleaner fuels have contributed to a 99% drop in vehicle tailpipe pollutants since the 1960s. Our industry's approach extends to emerging technologies, including hydrogen, carbon capture, and storage, which are key to a lower carbon future. My third point is that energy security is linked to national security. Oil and natural gas are traded globally, and the United States is not an energy island. Russia's war against Ukraine created new and uncomfortable norms for energy and foreign policy. America must lead on energy. Our allies know this well. The European Union's commitment to eliminating the reliance on Russian natural gas represents the biggest fundamental shift ever in global natural gas markets. Fortunately for them, American producers quickly stepped up and became the largest LNG supplier to Europe. We must also not forget the vital role that U.S. LNG played in meeting soaring energy demand in Asia and the rest of the developing world. The bottom line is clear. America's global energy leadership has never been more important. In conclusion, America's energy solutions are right under our feet. Our industry can and will produce the energy the world needs, while also continuing to lead in reducing emissions and investing in the technologies of the future. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity, and this concludes my prepared statement.
Thank you, Ms. Eversole. Mr. Hausker, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. Thanks for this opportunity to testify in a very timely hearing as we head into the COP28. I first want to say there is complete agreement, I think, among all the witnesses and in the opening statements of the members on our triumph over conventional air pollutant problems. It is almost miraculous what has happened over the last 30 years. But I also want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Tonko, said the cause of that was our collective choice to solve these problems through laws and policies, and then turn over to the private sector the job of inventing the solutions. That's how those two things work together, and we can apply those to the climate problem, too. The first 4 pages of my testimony recap 2 points. Climate change is happening now. It's causing major damage in the U.S. and around the world. These are the impacts we're experiencing at warming of a little over 1 degree centigrade. And we are at a crossroads. We can choose to ignore the climate problem and just keep using fossil fuels at current rates or even higher rates. And we can warm the planet to 2.5 to 3 degrees or more. And we will experience the escalating damages that come with that to our health, to ecosystems, to the economy, and to our national security. Or we can choose another path. We can forge ahead with a transition to low and zero emission energy sources and stabilize our climate, grow our economy, and enhance our security. That is the crossroads, in my view, that we are at. Now, if we choose that latter path, the transition requires us in the coming decades to ultimately take our GHG emissions all the way to net zero. This transition will be challenging, to be sure, but it is a far better choice than experiencing the damages in store for all of us if we continue to recklessly change our climate, which has otherwise been stable for thousands of years as our civilization developed. So how do we get to net zero? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has looked at hundreds of scenarios that could take us to this transition. All of these scenarios require sharp decreases in unabated fossil fuels, meaning fossil fuels without significant carbon capture. And they require major increases in zero or low emission sources, such as solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear, and some fossil fuel use with carbon capture. Figure 5 on my testimony, which you can look at, looks at a scenario like this. The basic story of all these scenarios is massive increases in electricity use, which can displace fossil fuels across transportation applications, industry, buildings, et cetera. We can also use electricity to produce hydrogen and other zero and low carbon fuels. The IPCC has not found any plausible or credible scenario that lets us continue to burn fossil fuels at our current rates while solving the climate problem. The good news is we have peaked emissions in the U.S. They're going down. They're about 2% below 1990 levels. And again, we're all working from the same set of facts on that. Unfortunately, we have lots of work ahead of us, as Mr. Tonko said, to take those down further and work with other nations to do the same. The good news also is we have put in place a framework for developing the key technologies we need. We've passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Together, these form a comprehensive program of research, development, demonstration, and deployment of clean energy technologies. In there is support for R&D, for the technologies we need to bring out of the lab to commercialization. We have support for demonstrations of technologies that need just a little bit more of a push. And we have support for deployment of more mature technologies that can lower costs as they get to higher and higher scales. We have support for the key infrastructure in terms of transmission, hydrogen hubs, carbon dioxide hubs for capture, EV charging. And most importantly, in my mind, the IRA takes a technology-neutral approach to incentivizing these technologies. We're not picking winners anymore. If you have a zero-carbon electricity source, you get an incentive. This program is already working. It's spurred hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, and it's bringing new jobs. And we're also tackling the problem of low-income communities and energy-impacted communities. We have extra incentives to locate these projects in those communities. So yes, we've come a long way on conventional air pollutants. We have a long way still yet to go on climate change, but we have a framework in place. We will need additional things as we look for our 2030 and 2050 goals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to our discussion and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hausker. Mr. Mills, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, for the opportunity to testify. Permit me to begin by contrasting rhetoric with reality. The phrase an energy transition, the goal to replace hydrocarbons, has origins that trace back to a 1977 speech by President Jimmy Carter. That speech had a lot of familiar rhetoric, such as, quote, the greatest challenge that our country will face during our lifetime, and, quote, the need to act quickly in order to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren, end quote. This was all motivated back then, of course, by the belief that the world was running out of hydrocarbons. In our time, the transition rhetoric is directed at replacing an overabundant supply of hydrocarbons in service, of course, of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. The reality, despite decades of spending and policies on a transition, oil, gas, and coal today supply about 82% of global energy. To put that reality in the more recent context, the past 2 decades have seen over $5 trillion of spending globally on wind and solar and similar efforts to avoid hydrocarbons. And this did reduce hydrocarbons' share of energy, but just by 2 percentage points. And the quantity, not share, of hydrocarbons consumed globally has increased by an amount equal in energy equivalent terms to adding 6 Saudi Arabia's worth of oil production. Today, solar and wind combined supply under 4% of global energy. And for context, burning wood, oldest energy source known to mankind, still supplies 10% of global energy. But energy transitionists now claim this time is different. There are differences. Costs of wind and solar and batteries are radically better. But another key difference is a shift in the nature and location of critical upstream industrial infrastructures. Because of the underlying physics realities, fabricating wind, solar, and battery hardware entails a radical increase in the use of a range of minerals from copper and nickel to aluminum and graphite and rare earths such as neodymium. Increases range from 700% to 4,000% more minerals per unit of energy production. This will require an astonishing and unprecedented increase in global output from the old school industries of mining and mineral refining. And while the U.S. is the world's biggest hydrocarbon producer, China is the world's biggest producer of energy minerals, and has a global market share at least triple the U.S. share in hydrocarbons. China produces over 60% of the world's aluminum, refines over half of the world's copper, 90% of rare earths, 60% of refined lithium, 80% of lithium battery graphite, and 50 to 90% of the chemicals and polymer parts used in lithium batteries. That dominance will not be easily or quickly altered. And because energy minerals are incredibly energy intensive, China has a profound advantage with its low-cost electric grid that uses coal for 2/3 of power production. And China is building more coal plants at the rate of roughly one a week and will do so for close to a decade. Those additional coal plants will lead to an additional 2 gigatons of CO2 emitted per year from China. Meanwhile, energy transitionists estimate that the U.S. CO2 emissions will decrease at most by only 1 gigaton after the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act deploys over $1 trillion on alternative energy that will require directly or indirectly purchasing energy minerals from China. Seems like a bad trade. The U.S. already saw a 1 gigaton per year reduction in CO2 emissions over the past decade without massive subsidies or increased imports due to the well-known shale revolution that collapsed the cost of natural gas, making it cheaper than coal. The key effect of that brought huge economic and geopolitical benefits for the United States. All these realities point to some more sensible options when it comes to a goal to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions. Rather than subsidize U.S. assembly of batteries using imported materials, instead encourage, even subsidize if we have to, domestic production of pipelines and ports to export more liquefied natural gas. That would yield greater emissions reductions and per dollar by encouraging other nations that are now planning to burn more coal to instead import U.S. LNG. It would also benefit domestic industries and the balance of trade, as well as yield non-trivial geopolitical benefits. A start would be to change the mission of the DOE office that regulates permissions to export LNG and instead repurpose it as an office of export assistance. Other options would be more cost-effective than those driven by the IRA subsidies, could include a more sensible and expansive posture towards nuclear energy, pursuing improved combustion efficiency, and engaging serious efforts to resolve the barriers to reshoring far more U.S. mining and refining. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for the opportunity.
Gentleman yields back, and we will now begin questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Mills, I know you've been talking for 5 minutes, but I'll go straight to you right now. You know, earlier I discussed how the shale revolution has saved American families thousands of dollars while simultaneously reducing emissions dramatically, and I'm afraid those savings and accomplishments are being disregarded because of rush to green policies. Earlier this year, economists from Wood Mackenzie estimated the cumulative cost of the Inflation Reduction Act's energy subsidies at $2.7 trillion by 2060. So, Mr. Mills, in your opinion, does the IRA ignore affordability and reliability in favor of the green mirage of environmental sustainability?
Well, the short answer is yes. The magnitude of subsidies and mandates, and of course the Wood Mackenzie analysis included off-budget mandates that have a real cost to the economy. The magnitude of this amount of spending means by definition it's anti-productive. We're getting the same product, the same energy delivered to society, the same mile of driving, the same unit of heat, the same hour on compute time at higher inherent costs to society, not lower costs.
Well, and this is an obvious answer. We know the answer to this question, but where are the energy resources such as wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, and their raw materials produced? And is it fair to characterize the IRA as a taxpayer-subsidized transfer of American environmental leadership to China and other global polluters? So where are they produced, right? Just would you affirm that for us?
Well, I think we know, as I pointed out in my testimony, the underlying production of the key input materials and minerals are overseas, dominantly in China. We are exporting carbon dioxide. We are exporting pollution. We are exporting labor challenges. We're exporting, not leadership, we're exporting the inverse. We're actually pushing challenges into fragile economies in Africa, Indonesia, where ecosystems are not protected the way ours are.
Yeah. Ms. Eversole, since 2016, the United States has increased its daily LNG exports from 0 to over 12.1 billion cubic feet per day, a tremendous success for stamping out global energy poverty, asserting U.S. strength in reducing global emissions. Yet, as your testimony points out, approximately 40 million tons per year of LNG export capacity is currently languishing in the Department of Energy's permitting process. Can you discuss the global benefits to energy affordability, reliability, and the environment if we were to expand domestic LNG exports?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate your leadership on H.R. 1130. The amount of natural gas that's sitting, languishing at the Department of Energy is equal to the entire usage of the country of India. I mean, contextually, that is an enormous amount that we could put into the global markets. And the important part about what America's leadership is we are market stabilizing force. The global market for LNG is actually quite stable, even amidst a very challenging geopolitical world. And that's the role that America can play, but we need to continue to play that role. I'll remind you that this is a depletion business, right? We have to continue to invest today to be able to produce tomorrow.
Okay. You mentioned my bill, my Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act. It would remove antiquated trade restrictions and grant the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission exclusive authority for permitting LNG export terminals. Do you think such a policy is a pro-growth policy, and would it help to aid in the export of clean, burning American natural gas?
We certainly do, and we appreciate your leadership, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Menezes, you have expertise here. Should we wait any longer to pass this LNG legislation, especially with its strategic and emissions-reducing benefits?
Thank you for the question. Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, we need to reform permitting processes where we can. We need to, not lessen the standards, but to look at the timetables. And with respect to the current authorization process at DOE, really the law, when Congress amended it back in 2005, really did not put any timelines or anything in place that would compel the agency to act within a certain time frame. At that time, Congress focused more on what was happening at FERC.
My time has expired, Mr. Menezes, so let me rephrase that question and ask it one last time quickly, yes or no. Should we wait any longer to pass this LNG export ban lift? Should we move forward with it?
I mean, the short answer is no. I think today we've heard urgency
Okay.
is what needs to
All
take
right,
place.
thank you. I yield back, and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to our witnesses. Dr. Hausker, members have already mentioned that the United States has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 17% from 2005 levels up to 2021. But the U.S. Nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement is some 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. And the Biden administration is also committed to economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050. So, Dr. Hausker, can you give us a reality check here? Despite some progress, how well is the United States doing to achieve its targets? The mic.
The most recent estimates for where we will be in 2030, given the passage of the three laws that I mentioned, is that we'll be close to a 42% reduction in emissions below 2005 levels. So these bills, plus other trends like that all of our witnesses here have described, are taking us closer and closer to our 50% goal for 2030. However, we will need to take additional actions, and the Biden administration has some of those in the works, and I know some of them are also being proposed up here on the Hill that can take us and meet that 50% goal.
Thank you, and so that's clear there's more that must be done. How is that incentive-based strategy to reduce pollution working, included in the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law to keep those targets within reach? And if you could also include projections to see increased deployment of clean energy technologies, solar, wind, electric vehicles, et cetera, to replace fossil fuel power equipment in our energy system over the next decade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act in particular has put in a set of incentives that is already generating waves of investment across the U.S. And it's great to see they're happening in red states, they're happening in blue states, they're happening in purple states, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in the works that will ultimately, by one estimate, create, I think, 1.5 million jobs, new jobs by 2030. We are seeing a surge, and we're also seeing, because of the structure of the incentives, we're also seeing more onshore manufacturing, which will hopefully counter the trend that Mr. Mills was pointing to. We're seeing development of lithium mines. I think there was just an announcement earlier this week on the Salton Sea project. That's a very positive development. So all the incentives in the IRA across nuclear, across carbon capture, across renewables, across the infrastructure hubs for hydrogen and carbon dioxide pipelines, they are all, you look at a map of the U.S. and that has identified where these projects are, and they're literally covering the country. It's very encouraging.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Hausker, again, can you give us a sense of whether complementary regulatory policies could help maximize uptake of these incentives?
Yes, Mr. Tonko, as you said earlier, public policy is often most effective when it's a combination of carrots and well-designed sticks, meaning intelligent, effective policy. And the incentives are really jump-starting a lot of the new technology development, but to get the deployment that we need, we will probably also need intelligent regulatory policies. And the Biden administration has those under development for the power sector, for various transportation applications as well.
And when we look at these regulatory trends, has this been true in the power sector in the past? And when we talk about the title of this hearing, our history as a global leader in reducing emissions, have EPA standards helped spur the deployment of scrubbers and other pollution controls for traditional air pollutants?
Absolutely. There are very few instances of pollution control technology or other environmental technology being developed purely without public policy driving it, because the benefits are not captured by the businesses that would develop them and deploy those. So it's a very simple recipe that when we collectively decide to attack an environmental problem and reduce it, we set standards, we set performance goals, and then the incredible scientific and engineering talent of the United States comes into play and develops those technologies. True for scrubbers, true for selective catalytic reduction, true for something as simple as bag houses, and on. Catalytic converters for automobiles. All of those were driven by policy. They didn't just appear magically or organically in the marketplace.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I constantly hear my colleagues on the other side mention extreme weather events, and I just want to point out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their assessment report 6, makes this statement. The IPCC has concluded that a signal of climate change has not yet emerged beyond natural variability, what would normally occur, for the following phenomenon: river floods, heavy precipitation and pluvial floods, landslides, droughts of all types, severe windstorms, tropical cyclones, sand and dust storms, heavy snowfall and ice storms, hail, snow avalanche, coastal flooding, marine heat waves. So I just hope that this report is kind of their Bible. They need to adhere to Scripture. I'm going to ask you some questions, Mr. Mills. The Energy Information Administration just released a report in October that said heating homes with natural gas will be 40% less expensive than electricity. Is that part of, should that be an objective of this Congress to try to ensure that American citizens, particularly people in low income, senior households on fixed incomes, are able to afford their household utility bills?
Only in the broadest sense, in the sense that the goal in energy policy should be, first and foremost, is adequate, affordable supply of energy. by
Right.
definition. But I am color me a deep doubter of the logic underlying that claim in the EIA. I'm sorry to say, they often do excellent work. It's not cheaper. On average, it's more expensive for many markets. And the problem is all the policies that are being put into place.
For natural gas or?
Financial costs of electric heat over gas heat.
No. It says natural gas is less expensive than electric.
Oh, it is, yes, absolutely. Natural gas is less expensive on average and has prospects for staying cheaper far longer given current policies.
Right. And it also, natural gas that we use here in the U.S. has fewer emissions issues than, say, Russian gas. The reason I bring that up is I keep trying to raise this point, especially to my colleagues across the aisle, is that as Europe has made this massive transition to renewables, it's resulted in unaffordable household utility bills. And last winter, there were 68,000 people died. It was attributed to excess winter deaths because they couldn't afford to adequately heat their homes. I do not consider that collateral damage. I think maybe some people would think that that's acceptable in this battle over climate change. I'm also very concerned, and you've raised some excellent points in your report. I've read your reports, and it's not just an economic issue when you start talking about supply chain issues. It's also a national security issue. And I think you all have made those points very well. I think that's something that this committee should take seriously, is that when we're dependent on an adversarial nation for critical minerals, for rare earth elements, all of which you absolutely have to even, we don't make batteries here, we assemble batteries. And one of the points I've tried to make to some of the folks that I talked with from Europe is that the war in Ukraine not only did not cause the energy crisis, it exposed it, but it also exposed something else. No nation should be reliant on an adversarial nation for something that's critical to its economy and its national security as energy. And when you go 100% renewable or 80% renewable, you choose the number, you become reliant on an adversarial nation. How would you respond to that, Mr. Menezes?
Right, so what we have seen in the United States, I mean, we are, because of the shale revolution, we have an abundance of affordable, cheap natural gas, which we are using. And in the electricity space, it complements the growth of renewables very well, because as you grow renewables, more and more electricity is used during the times, and you need, when they ramp down, you need to be able to ramp up to keep the system operating 24/7. People don't expect to go into brownouts and blackouts, and what we've seen is natural gas complements that nicely. So we're doing two things in the United States. We're using natural gas to replace coal for electricity generation, and it's complementing the increased use in renewables. That can be replicated not only here in the United States, but all across the world.
Well, in the last few seconds here, I just think that we need to have a people-first policy and do what's best for people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, the Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies Office released results of the most comprehensive analysis to date, quantifying the domestic lithium resources in California's Lithium Valley region in my district. The analysis found that Lithium Valley's total resources could produce enough lithium to support over 375 million electric vehicles' batteries. This is more than the total number of cars currently on the roads in the U.S. Lithium Valley is essential for the Biden administration's plan to meet 50% electric vehicle adoption by 2030. Developing our domestic lithium supply chain at Lithium Valley will play an integral role in decarbonizing the economy, creating good-paying jobs, and strengthening our national security. And the kicker is that this is the cleanest way of extracting lithium from the earth. It's filtered out of the brine of geothermal production in a closed-loop circuit. So I am proud that this report confirms what I have been saying all along, that my district will play a critical role in reaching these goals. Dr. Hausker, can you discuss the importance of developing a secure domestic supply chain for critical minerals like lithium and how these efforts will contribute to reaching our climate goals?
Sorry. Absolutely. It's really encouraging, the report that you cited, and lithium batteries are going to be critical to the electrification of transportation. And we know that those vehicles are going to be cheaper to maintain than internal combustion vehicles, and we know that they will have a much smaller carbon footprint overall once we can shift the light-duty fleet and increasingly like medium-duty vehicles as well. The incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act also will lead us to be onshoring other critical mineral production as well as manufacturing capabilities here. I agree with the other witnesses. We want to minimize as much as possible our dependence on adversarial countries for any kind of products. We're seeing that the world remains a dangerous place. So every step in that direction will be a good one.
Thank you. And while this DOE analysis has made it clear that Lithium Valley there around the Salton Sea can significantly bolster our nation's lithium supply, we need to ensure that we meet all of our critical mineral needs for clean energy development and deployment. This means fostering relationships with allies to develop robust and sustainable critical mineral supply chains with high environmental and labor standards. Dr. Hausker, how can the U.S. leverage our position as a global leader to meet our critical mineral needs with the highest standards possible?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can. We do have very high standards for production of minerals now and other extractive industries in the U.S. And that's, again, where I think all the witnesses here are on the same page. So to the extent that we can maximize that production, great. To the extent that when we do purchase overseas, we can also put conditions and incentives for those countries also to adhere to similar standards. That will also improve the situation.
And so how does robust U.S. engagement at the COP position us to achieve our clean energy and climate goals?
Yeah, it is very refreshing that we are back in a leadership position and that our negotiators can go to the COP holding their heads high, having passed the Inflation Reduction Act, these other laws, and resuming the leadership position that we have had in the past. It's going to be a difficult COP. There's many issues on the table, as always, but it is refreshing that the U.S. is there as a leader.
Thank you. Look, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to produce a battery supply chain that is 100% American. And isn't it that what this hearing has been about? The need to invest in domestic energy? And the DOE report on domestic lithium at Lithium Valley confirms that we can do just that. Further, this report confirms everything we've known, that the need to invest in domestic energy in critical minerals and battery technology is critical, not pollutants like fossil fuels. And so I'd like to personally invite Chairwoman McMorris-Rodgers and Ranking Member Pallone to Lithium Valley for a field hearing. Have a field hearing in my district that will allow members of this committee to see firsthand the progress that we are making in investing in domestic energy and critical minerals. The investment in the future of energy is in Lithium Valley, and the more we invest in domestic energy here, the faster we'll achieve our net zero emissions economy. So I'll follow up. We'll do it during the winter when it's 70 degrees in my district and like 15 degrees here. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to my colleague, Mr. Ruiz, thank you for the invite. I think it's very important that we explore supply chains and the realities of what it's going to take to meet some of the goals around mining and processing. Unfortunately, we continue to see where this administration is shutting down the mining and the processing permits in the United States of America. And so for those who are suggesting that this can be all done in America, I'm waiting for the administration to start saying yes to securing the supply chains that are truly American sourced and uphold the high environmental standards that we have come to cherish in the United States. The United States has been leading. The United States has led, continues to lead. And our record of environmental stewardship, whether it's air quality, cleaner waters, it must be recognized. It must be celebrated. And I grow weary of my colleagues ignoring the success and what America has done. The entrepreneurs, the innovators here, our energy producers and industries have made these achievements possible. And it is so important to our security and to the productiveness of our nation. We've done this while improving the efficiency of energy production, the efficiency of everyday products that people rely on, while continuing to lower greenhouse gases more than any other nation in the world. So we should examine the ingredients of this success and the lessons it holds for enabling the delivery of affordable, reliable energy. And we must look at what it means for advancing environmental progress. So, Mr. Menezes, I wanted to start with you. The United States Energy Association has decades of experience working with developing nations. Would you speak briefly about the needs for communities within these nations to provide reliable, affordable energy to their people?
Thank you for the question. You know, unlike the U.S., where we are replacing different types of energy with others, in the developing countries, they are looking for electricity. They're looking for energy for the first time. So typically, a successful program cannot show up and say, we're here in the United States and we're going to impose on you what we think that you need to have, if it's 100% renewables or not. Our experience shows it has to be community involvement, it has to be acceptance, and it takes time to get the communities to embrace what forms of energy they're going to have. And it's important that a couple of things happen. It has to be reliable. Once they get electricity, they do not want to have it intermittent. Two, it has to be affordable. And you need to make sure that you have bring the resources for capacity building to make sure that when they operate that system and they figure out how they have to do it, that when you leave, they will continue to operate that system.
Thank you. Mrs. Eversole, increasing people's capacity to thrive and prosper is a good thing, both here in America and around the world. If we build on our shale revolution, export more of our energy, our technology, our know-how, will that help or harm people?
It will absolutely help people. Thank you for the question. You know, like you, I'm a military spouse, and the men and women of this industry feel deeply not only about producing affordable, reliable energy, but about serving our country. And for us, it's about a pragmatic approach going forward. It's about not 2- and 4-year political cycles, but it's really about using our engineering know-how and capacity to deliver not just for Americans here, but for our allies around the world. And look no further than what we've done for our allies in Europe just over the last 2 years.
Thank you. Mr. Mills, we celebrate the highest environmental standards here in the United States of America, I mean, anywhere in the world. Would you speak to how prosperity helps advance environmental stewardship in other places?
Well, there's a lot of good scholarship on this, Madam Chairman. There's a direct correlation between wealth and improving the environment. It's a direct correlation between wealth and affording health care and affording all the luxuries in life that we have in the Western world. And wealth doesn't come from increasing the cost of energy. So a primary goal of governments for most of history has been to drive down the cost of food and fuel, to free up wealth for protecting the environment and other luxuries that we enjoy in the West.
That's right. And especially on the world stage, like at COP28, we must be honest about the reality and the risk of following an energy path in the name of greenhouse gases that seeds American leadership and by all accounts runs right into the control of China, which is the world's largest polluter. So Mr. Mills, we've discussed with you before how a rush to green agenda drives reliance on renewables that really aren't green, and especially when China's in control. But just would you speak to that briefly in the time remaining?
I think just to restate, China is the utter dominant supplier of energy minerals, refining and producing the products. It took them 2 decades to build that industrial infrastructure. We will not reverse that with a few $1 million in a few years, not even a decade. I applaud efforts to reshore American manufacturing and mining, but they're grossly insufficient, and they run headlong into the third rail, which is environmental laws, and particularly NEPA.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Petroleum for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To meet our ambitious climate goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 and shifting to net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050, the federal government needs to use a three-pronged approach. We must incentivize American innovation and broader deployment of clean energy, set a strong regulatory framework to drive down emissions here at home, and thirdly, foster domestic and international partnerships to meaningfully address the global climate crisis. So my questions are of Mr. Hausker. Do you agree that all three of these elements are necessary to drive down emissions and meet our climate goals? Figure that.
You know, by the end of the hearing, I'll learn to turn this button on, just in time. I think the three-pronged strategy you outlined is the correct one. I would add to the innovation strategy also the deployment and how I described the provisions of the three bills that we now have in place as laws. They work across research and development, which is innovation, demonstration, taking things out of the lab and demonstrating first of a kind, second of a kind, and then fourth, deployment. And depending on the state of the clean energy technology, one wants to focus incentives across that valley of, or that spectrum of technology development. So I would add deployment to your innovation first prong. Regulatory framework, we talked a little bit about previously, where you often need a regulatory framework to accelerate the deployment of key technologies across key end uses to decarbonize the economy. And finally, the international partnership piece is very important. No one country causes climate change. No one country can solve it. That's why we have a climate treaty. That's why we're working with 190 other countries collectively to try to find the path forward. And those partnerships take many forms. Sometimes they're provisions of the climate treaty or commitments under that. Sometimes they're groups of countries that will get together outside of the climate treaty. We have the Project Phoenix effort to advance small modular reactors. We have methane initiatives. We're looking forward also, of course, to whatever industry announces at the COP in terms of private sector initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases. Those are often catalyzed with government partners as well. So yes, we need all sorts of partnerships across the international sphere to address, again, a very complex and global problem.
I think you actually answered a lot of the other questions I was going to ask, but let me just combine a couple here and ask one more thing. First, well, how do incentives like those Congress enacted with the Inflation Reduction Act help accelerate climate action? And then if you could speak to how EPA regulations complement the IRA's climate and clean energy investments and the importance of EPA's regulations for driving down emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it is really a visionary bill that has a set of tax incentives across all the important end uses of energy use, and they also have a structure to them where you get additional tax benefits for domestic manufacturing or content. You get additional incentives for locating a project in either a low-income community or perhaps an energy-impacted community, like a town in West Virginia that is on its heels because of a closed coal mine or something like that. So it's really a great structure to advance our climate goals, our domestic manufacturing goals, and improving equity across society.
And what about the EPA regulations as a complement to that?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right now we have, let's look at cars. We have a set of tax incentives for electric vehicles, and that will induce a certain level of purchasing over the coming years. But EPA is also looking at a set of performance standards for vehicles that would not require all EVs, but would require the fleet to move to an average of less and less greenhouse gas emissions. So there'd still be roles for plug-in hybrids, there'd still be roles for very efficient internal combustion engines, and so a well-crafted regulation can move the whole fleet closer and closer to zero emissions as the tax incentive lowers the cost to the consumer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is extremely important. This is an issue that all of us are concerned about. I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of pristine coastline. I'm very proud of that, as you can tell, and love the environment, want to protect our environment. It's very important. But, you know, I always feel like and I've been very involved in environmental issues, obviously, as I should, representing the entire coast of Georgia. But I've always felt like we've not gotten the credit here in the United States that we deserve in decreasing our greenhouse gases and decreasing our carbon emissions. We have decreased our carbon emissions more in the last decade than the next 12 countries combined. While growing our economy, it can be done. I've always said the greatest scientists, the greatest innovators are right here in the United States of America. That's why we got to get out of the way and let them do their job. They've proven they can do it. They've proven if we get out of the way, we being the federal government, and let them do their job, that they can innovate and that they can decrease carbon emissions, and they will do that. I have been on the petroleum, on the fossil fuels. I've been on their back telling them, you need to take more credit for the progress that you've made, and I feel like they do. They've made good progress. I've served on the Select Committee on Climate Change and on the Conservative Climate Caucus, had the opportunity to travel to Europe, and I saw mistakes that they made in Europe. They have allowed their policies to get ahead of their innovation, and it's caused them to have to backtrack. And I think that's an important lesson we can learn here in America, not to let that happen. This rush to green that we're having, we all want clean energy. And that's very important, but this rush to green is going to bankrupt us for one thing, and it's also going to cause us to have to backtrack like they have in Europe, where they're now going back to coal-powered plants because they've already closed some of their nuclear plants because they've let their policies get ahead of their innovation. So I hope that's an important lesson that we can learn. Ms. Eversole, I want to ask you, you know, obviously you've heard from me, you've heard from everyone up here, at least on this side of the aisle, that our fossil fuel industry has allowed us to be a leader in emission reductions while growing our economy. Is it true that natural gas is responsible for 58% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emission reductions?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I grew up in Georgia and spent a lot of time in the summer down in your district. It's a beautiful place, and appreciate your leadership. Look, I also just want to remind us the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Very frequently, the debate gets around this false choice of either or. Either we can be cleaner or we can continue down a path of using fossil fuels. This industry has proven that we can do both. And so if what the problem we're trying to solve is that we're trying to maximize the reduction of emissions from our atmosphere for the minimum cost to society, I think everybody in this room can agree on that. If, on the other hand, the problem that we're trying to solve is pick winners and losers among sources of fuel, obviously that's going to create a problem. So this industry has demonstrated that we can continue to do both, and we look forward to doing so.
But specifically on natural gas, because I'm a big proponent of natural gas here in America. It's cleaner than the natural gas coming out of Russia. It's cleaner than anywhere else in the world. And how can we duplicate that? How can we replicate that, if you will, globally?
The innovative spirit of this industry is really is something that is the envy of the world. Look no further than what we've done in helping our allies in Europe in delivering LNG at a time when they had to completely reroute the global supply chain, because American gas, in our view, is a whole lot better than gas from Russia.
Absolutely, couldn't agree. Mr. Mills, let me go to you real quick, because nuclear is a big part of our energy portfolio in Georgia. As you know, I'm sure, we just started up the reactor number 3 at Plant Vogtle in Georgia, and reactor number 4 will start hopefully the first quarter of next year. And I have Plant Hatch in my district that has been in operation since 1975. What role can nuclear play in meeting future energy demands?
Certainly a very significant one, and I think the key here is to get realistic about doing what France is doing and Finland and now Sweden, which is to accelerate the regulatory structure permitting the construction of what we already know how to build, which are the classic nuclear power plants like Vogtle. Time matters in those. And then simultaneously accelerate programs that can bring next generation smaller nuclear plants online.
How can we get away from the negative connotations, if you will, of nuclear?
That's
it's baseload clean energy. We need to be using more of it.
That's certainly a subject that will take more than one hearing to address.
Good. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Dingell.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hausker, in your written testimony, you mentioned that carbon emissions have decreased substantially since 2007, largely because of cleaner electricity generation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But however, just by what's happening now, carbon emissions still are not projected to decrease sufficiently to meet the global standards that they need to meet. Isn't that right?
That's also correct.
Now, do you think that industry can reach these goals completely on its own, or does government need to work with industry to try to help generate cleaner energy?
Yes, as we've said in the history of environmental problem solving, leaving industry and business alone to come up with the solutions or to do them on their own typically does not work. We need policy frameworks. Businesses welcome policy frameworks that are smart, effective, and flexible. And that is what the Biden administration is attempting to put in place, and what Congress has done with the 3 laws that we've been discussing.
And as a matter of fact, I meet with industry quite a bit, and this is what they say to me: it would be really helpful for them if they had clear guidelines that they could follow. Any of the 3 industry witnesses who are here today, do you disagree with that? Okay, they're shaking their heads no. So the other thing I want to ask you, you do disagree with that. I'm sorry, Mr. Mills.
Well, it's an important subject, but I do disagree with the category. It's called a category error to assume that regulations can create solutions.
I never said that.
No,
I said, does industry want to work with policymakers to make standards so people would know what they had to do?
They always prefer to know what they have to do. Absolutely,
Right.
Congressman. That's
Right.
for sure.
So also, Mr. Hausker, would you say that, as my colleague from Georgia, I'm sorry he just left, he said the rush to green energy is hurting the economy. Is that correct?
I don't think that's correct. I think we have seen, again, continued economic growth, continued job growth, certainly over the last couple of years. And so the policies that have been put in place have not hurt growth or employment in the last couple of years. And I think, I forget, maybe it was Mr. Menezes' testimony or other recounting, when we look at the whole history from 1970 on, after we pass aggressive environmental laws, we don't see the economy tanking. We see that economic growth and environmental protection can go hand in hand.
And in fact, what we've seen, at least in the short period since we've passed this landmark legislation the last few years, is the green jobs and the economy and the green energy industry are really growing substantially, and even traditional fossil fuel companies are using some of the benefits to refocus and to hire and develop. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, I would also ask you, do you think that that limiting non-CO2 emissions, including methane, is important to staying within the necessary warming limits?
Absolutely. The non-CO2 gases represent about 80% of the warming that's occurring, so we need to reduce methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, and the other trace industrial gases that were, many of which were addressed under the Kigali Amendment ratification that was discussed earlier.
Okay. So do you think just to put a finer point on it, the Methane Emission Reduction Program, or MERP, is going to help us put us on track to meet the commitments under the Global Methane Pledge, which is to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030?
Yes, absolutely essential.
So I know we've been talking, and I apologize, I was late. I had to be a teller in one of the Democratic elections that we were having. But the U.S. and China came to an agreement to prioritize increasing renewable energy sources to displace energy created by fossil fuels. And China, as we know, is the world's largest methane emitter. This is the first time that they've agreed to limit non-CO2 emissions. How does this agreement between the two largest greenhouse gas emitters set the stage for similar efforts at COP28?
This is a classic example of good diplomacy, in this case bilateral diplomacy by the U.S. And China, getting them to get on board on reducing methane, not just focusing on CO2 emissions. I hope I addressed the thrust of your question.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Dr. Joyce from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
First, I want to thank Chairman Johnson for holding today's important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing with us. It should be no surprise to anyone that America is leading the way on emission reduction. We are showing the world how to continue to grow economically, how to provide affordable and reliable energy to our citizens, and how to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. Between 2005 and 2021, America's greenhouse emissions were cut by 17%, according to the EPA. Was this due to some new emerging green technology or scientific breakthrough? No. It was achieved by using the resources underneath the feet of my constituents and unlocking the natural gas potential in places like Pennsylvania. Let's be clear, there are some exciting and innovative developments happening in the energy sector, specifically in my home state of Pennsylvania. 2 new hydrogen hubs have been established in the state where we hope to utilize our nuclear and natural gas resources to produce and ultimately unlock a new future of hydrogen power. Companies like Westinghouse are working on the future of nuclear power and hope to provide new reactor options to the market. Recently, I visited the quarries at Specialty Granules in Franklin County in my district in Pennsylvania, where they are actually looking to use emerging technology to take part in the carbon capture right at the quarry. Despite all this innovation, the core of what has made Pennsylvania an energy superpower are the coal and natural gas energy sources. These resources have provided firm, 24/7 resources to Americans across our nation and keep the heat on during the winter storms. Renewables may be an exciting trend to some, but what we need is a dispatchable power capacity that fossil fuels provide. That is why we must focus on incorporating coal and natural gas into our future emission plans instead of waging war on these industries. China and India alone have built hundreds of coal power plants over the last decade. There is no green argument that is going to convince China and India to shutter these facilities. The only way to tackle the emissions that these plants cause is to develop effective and affordable carbon capture. And the nation that can develop this technology is the United States. We need a strong domestic coal industry that can work with the Department of Energy to develop and deploy this technology. Instead, by attacking the coal industry, government policies are making tackling global emissions much more difficult. Natural gas is the other great resource in Pennsylvania. It is the Marcellus Shale revolution that has led our country to dramatically cut emissions while continuing to provide reliable and affordable energy. The emerging problem that we are facing in this industry is a struggle to build new pipelines. That is why I introduced the Mountain Valley Pipeline Completion Act to bring Pennsylvania natural gas to the energy-starved southeastern United States. Thankfully, this bill was signed into law as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The sad fact is, without specific legislation approving a project, it is almost impossible to build a pipeline in the United States. To truly unlock Pennsylvania and America's energy potential, we need to have the pipeline capacity to deliver significant quantities of natural gas across our nation and to increase our liquid natural gas exports to our friends and allies. My first question is for you, Mrs. Eversole. a large portion of people in Northeast United States still rely on heating oil for their homes during the winter. The region is also forced to import foreign liquid natural gas during particularly cold periods. This situation is actually bizarre, given the potential of the resources that Pennsylvania has just a few states away. Can you discuss the reasons standing in the way of building a new pipeline in the Northeast?
Dr. Joyce, thank you for the question. Yeah, it comes down to this. It's very hard, if not impossible, unless it takes an act of Congress to build a pipeline in this country. It's wrong. Even if we were to move forward with a lot of the CCS technology, we need 50,000 miles of pipe for the CCS technology to really achieve the scale we need. We need to build more.
Do you see that there would be economic benefits and environmental benefits to the Northeast from a hypothetical pipeline from Pennsylvania?
Significant benefits.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I thank the witnesses for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes gentlelady from California, Ms. Batagon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The cause of climate change, one of the main causes of climate change, is the greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels. The solution, I believe, is to reduce and eventually end our reliance on fossil fuels. This must be the focus of the 28th United Nations Climate Conference that will begin later this week. However, the Republican message today around energy and climate is focused on increased fossil fuel production and liquefied natural gas exports. I'd like to enter into the record a preprint copy of a research study by Dr. Robert Howarth at Cornell, which shows that when accounting for emissions across the entire natural gas supply chain, LNG exported to and burned in other countries is worse than coal for the climate. Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so
Thank you.
ordered. We'll look at that.
I wanted to enter into the record.
Without objection, so
Thank
ordered.
you. Dr. Hausker, is reducing U.S. and global reliance on fossil fuels critical for any successful climate strategy?
Yes, as I described earlier, every IPCC scenario for meeting our climate goals requires sharp reductions.
And Dr. Hausker, the world is off track to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The U.S. has made progress. We expect a 3% decline in emissions this year, but we need 6% reductions each year through 2030 to meet our commitment under the Paris Climate Accord. Much of our reduction so far has come from the power sector, while transportation is now the largest emission source. Is a transition to zero emissions vehicles a critical part of any path to meet U.S. climate goals?
Yes, the transportation sector is critical, and if you look at the sectoral breakdown that I put in my written testimony, what's really fascinating about it is that the power sector has carried almost the entire burden of our reductions to date from that 2007 peak. Residential, industrial, commercial, agriculture, transportation have almost all been flat or just varying, fluctuating a little bit. So yes, we need to get the other sectors on downward trajectories as well.
Great. The EPA has proposed new regulations for cars and trucks that will accelerate the transition to zero emissions vehicles. How important is it that the EPA finalize the strongest possible rules for emissions reductions from cars and trucks?
Yes, a smart, effective regulatory policy combined with the incentives of the IRA is, in my mind, the best road forward.
Thank you. Dr. Hausker, the Department of Energy has proposed several long overdue updates to efficiency standards for washing machines, dryers, water heaters, stoves, and other appliances. These standards will reduce emissions and save Americans money on their energy bills. How important are these standards for the U.S. to meet its climate goals?
Yes, efficiency standards have a long history, and DOE has done an excellent job over the years of creating these regulations for efficiency that save customers money, save energy, and reduce greenhouse gases. And I'm sure this next wave will be equally effective, and again, will combine with IRA incentives for things like heat pumps.
Thank you. My last question is, recently the United States and China announced a new joint commitments on climate, including a goal to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. Does U.S. leadership on climate, through investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, which you just mentioned, help to bring countries like China and India to the table for these commitments?
Yes, I think by showing leadership on climate domestically, that puts us in a much stronger position to work with other countries also to ensure that they set good targets and meet them.
Oh, thank you. Is there anything that you want to add that you maybe haven't been asked about today?
Can I take a rain check on that?
Okay, sounds good. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask the witnesses some questions. And Mark, is your last name pronounced Menezes?
Menezes.
Menezes, that was what I was going to say. Mr. Menezes, quite frankly, it's kind of a survey. The vehicles that you personally drive, and we're going to go right down the line here, gas, diesel, hybrid, or EV, would you?
I've owned a hybrid since 2002.
Good. How about you?
You won't be surprised to hear that I have an internal combustion engine that runs on gas.
Okay.
My vehicle runs on wood. No, just kidding.
Okay. All right. Well, where the wood meets the road is, I'd like, so do you, gasoline vehicle, diesel, EV, or?
I drive an internal combustion engine. I hope soon to move to either a plug-in hybrid or an all-electric vehicle.
Okay, Mr. Mills?
I have a hybrid. I was a hybrid bull 20 years ago and published leading research on that. It's also partly fueled by corn, as you know.
All right. Well, so let the record show only the two middle are anti-EVs, you know. Just a little fun there.
API and WRI, just, we agree on everything.
True bipartisanship.
We do have some bipartisanship.
Mine's battery electric, not plug-in.
Okay. All right. Mr. Menezes, say your name again?
Menezes.
Menezes, I can do this. I want to echo a quote from your written testimony, quote, "Successful lasting projects were built from the ground up with community involvement and acceptance, not imposed on them because the U.S. thought it was a good idea," end quote. I think this is something, unfortunately, the Biden administration has not been doing, but should take into consideration as they actively try to pick winners and losers in many sectors, from the stuff that you actually talked about, Ms. Eversole. Mr. Menezes, Menezes, you note that U.S. CO2 emissions may decrease as much as 45% below the 2000 level, and you're doing your part.
That's EIA.
Yeah, you're doing your part for that, by the way.
Thank you.
Do innovations in a large part due in reduction innovations in fracking and increased utilization of natural gas. U.S. natural gas is the most environmentally friendly in the world. That's been noted, and demand for it is skyrocketing, as it should be. My district is seeing this firsthand with the 3 LNG export facilities along the Gulf Coast. How do you see U.S. natural gas exports playing a role in developing nations to provide clean and reliable energy, while at the same time lowering their emissions by moving on from biomass and other inefficient high-emission systems? We do want to note that it's not by driving wood-burning vehicles, Mr. Hausker. Go ahead.
Right. Well, in the developing countries, including India, for example, you know, they have always been looking at ways to import U.S. LNG and because in a lot of these developing countries, they have access to coal. So they know they can develop coal, but they are looking at alternatives. And U.S. LNG is an alternative. And so you see a lot of the development really all over the globe of trying to be able to import the U.S. LNG. And of course, it's over the pipeline Russia gas we see in Europe. So you see Europe growing. Those are developed countries, but also in the developing countries as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to move on just a little bit. The pledge made by the U.S. to reach net zero emissions, back to you, by 2050, in my opinion, is just totally unrealistic. Next thing you know, California governor will be calling for no charging electric vehicles between the hours of 9 and 3. Oh, wait, that's already happened. But primarily it's because of the permitting process. You raised a great point in your written testimony. Quote, "Today it makes much longer to obtain permits than it does to build the projects seeking government permission. It takes longer to get those permits than it does to build those projects." Let that sink in. So We have seen this with the EPA backlog of Class 6 wells, which are critical for CCS projects, which we have probably the largest carbon capture sequestration storage facility in the country in Port Arthur, Texas, which the administration is saying is a priority for them. Can you speak to how burdensome a permitting process could conflict with the goals of actually lowering emissions? That's you.
Right, and Congress recognized this in the debt limit bill. Congress actually amended NEPA and put timelines around environmental assessments and environmental impact statements required by NEPA. Congress recognized it's important to be able to put reasonable timelines in place. All applicants for these permits, these are very sophisticated applicants. They understand Clean Air Act requirements, Clean Water Act requirements. They understand NEPA. They do want certainty. And to the extent that you can do a comprehensive review within those timeframes helps us bring these emission reducing facilities online.
It's common sense, and I want to close quick by saying, Mr. Eversole, you said that the energy industry is extremely good at innovating and making these things work in the most efficient manner. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding this hearing today. I want to also thank our witnesses for being here to testify on our nation's ongoing efforts to reduce carbon emissions, the work that still remains, and the United States' role as a global leader in this space. This week, the UN Climate Change Conference of Parties, COP28, will meet to continue global cooperative measures to address the climate crisis and set new targets to reduce global emissions. That is why it is so imperative today to accurately evaluate the climate crisis, the work we must do to moving forward in the fight against climate change while keeping equity at the forefront of our efforts. Despite contributing little to the climate crisis, the devastating effects of climate change are felt hardest on communities of color and low-income communities. Even more concerning, environmental justice communities experience the least amount of investment in clean energy technologies. If we only focus on our previous success in emissions reduction, it will be these communities who continue to bear the heaviest burden of climate change. Dr. Hausker, can you speak to why investing in clean energy like wind and solar, rather than focusing solely on fossil fuels for electricity generation, is critical for a cleaner climate future and the promotion of environmental justice?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the increased use of solar and wind will further reduce emissions from the power sector, and that will benefit, I think, all citizens, but particularly reduce some of the higher concentrations in some of the urban areas that have environmental justice impacts. I also want to observe that the Inflation Reduction Act has a program of environmental justice grant making that is unprecedented in scope and size, and it also can bring jobs and clean energy projects to low-income communities through the added bonus tax incentives based on location. And I think that will also be very helpful to the communities you describe.
Yes, as you've rightly stated, last Congress, Democrats made historic investments in clean energy and the environment, saving families money and tackling the climate crisis. The Inflation Reduction Act alone provided $369 billion in investments for clean energy and reducing greenhouse gas pollution. But despite the success of the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law have had on the environment and the economy, my colleagues, Republican colleagues, continue to support efforts to undermine the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy and refuse to put forward any meaningful climate solutions. The status quo of environmental regulation is not enough to meet our climate goals. So, Dr. Hausker, your written statement, as well as the World Resource Institute State of Climate Action 2023 report, notes the progress made thus far toward reaching the goal set in the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2023. Can you share a bit more about our current emissions trajectory and what other steps the U.S. can take to combat the climate crisis and meet this goal?
At the global level, the emissions trajectory, as I put it, a figure in my written testimony, indicates that we are, as a globe, we're just beginning to perhaps flatten the global emissions. And if countries do meet their nationally determined contributions, we can begin to bend that curve a little bit. Obviously, and again, as the figure indicates, we need to be on a much steeper downward trajectory to have any chance of meeting a 1.5 or 2 degree goal. In the United States, as all witnesses agree, we peaked emissions in 2007. And we have been on a slight downward trajectory. The Biden administration has set goals of roughly 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That, again, will require additional steps beyond what Congress has enacted and the administration has taken so far. So we have a lot of work ahead. But again, I just want to emphasize, this is challenging. No one's saying this is easy. But it's either this path or a path to 2.5, 3, 3.5 degrees warming, and the acceleration of all the impacts we've been seeing over the last couple of years.
I couldn't have said it better, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, for holding this. Is an important hearing, and there's been a lot of conversation about actually who is in control of the temperature of this planet. As many of our witnesses have mentioned, the United States has been, through the free market and innovation, a world leader in reducing emissions. And we want to be good stewards of the environment, and we're leading the rest of the world. The U.S. produces some of the cleanest oil and gas in the world. I'm interested in reading that report that says that our natural gas that we are told burns 42% cleaner than what they're burning in Europe right now. Is how that, why that now is our natural gas is producing more carbon emissions. This whole subject is all over the boards, and it's not science-based. It's based on projections that, frankly, when you look at our planet compared to the entire system, if you look at it with a telescope the other way, we're gnats compared to the whole universal system. So, obviously, one of the things we've done in our district, and of course, is to Southern Company's credit. We've got Plant Vogtle first units 3 and 4. Unit 3 is fully operational and online, but it's been over 30 years. And Unit 4 is coming on next year. We know that nuclear energy is clean, reliable, affordable, and we know that over a period of time, it's very efficient. The Department of Energy says that Vogtles 3 and 4 will generate more than 17 million megawatt hours of clean energy and prevent 10 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions annually. Mr. Mills and Mr. Menezes, can you speak to the importance of these new units at Plant Vogtle, and as well as looking at additional nuclear possibilities as far as reducing emissions and increasing demand for electricity? And Mr. Menezes, you could go first, and then Mr. Mills.
Thank you very much. I agree with you on the use of nuclear for emission-free, dense energy over time. With respect to in the United States, however, Vogtle, because Southern Company is not in a bid-based electricity market and is in a regulated utility, that plant is going to be hard to replicate in our bid-based electricity markets. It's very, very difficult in the United States for price formation at FERC to allow a plant of that size in any of the other RTOs. So that's something the committee should look at. And so as a consequence, the industry is moving to small modular reactors, actually not of the size of Vogtle, different technologies. And we've seen that there's some exciting opportunities here in the United States, although NuScale recently, pulled out of their project with UAMPS, or UAMPS pulled out, which caused NuScale to develop. But the future of nuclear is great. We see globally the acceptance really of nuclear more than we do in the United States for the aforementioned reasons. It's just very difficult to be able to place and build now in the bid-based markets a nuclear facility.
Mr. Mills?
I'd just like to reemphasize that the challenge that the nuclear industry has is essentially a structural regulatory, as Mr. Menezes had pointed out. Building big reactors is what we know how to build, and we need to build a lot more of them faster. I think France will do that. Sweden's going to do it. The small reactors don't have a regulatory problem as much right now as a technology timeline problem. It'll take some years to build enough of them to know how they work and how to build them at scale. I'm sure it can happen. A different incentive structure is required for that, and I see very little evidence of that being put in place.
Well, there's really no incentive from the federal government to build these. In other words, it's disincentive. In other words, the larger the regulatory impact, you know, it's hard to raise the capital to build these things, and like you said, because of our situation there. Ms. Eversole, your testimony talked extensively about how the late 2000s, the private sector developed fracking and horizontal drilling in unlocked vast quantities. Can you discuss how lifting the oil export ban allowed the U.S. to wield more influence and really drive this economy?
I certainly can. Appreciate the question. Look, I mean, we have had an incredible influence on stabilizing the markets as a consequence of lifting the oil export ban in 2015. Production increased by a total of 1.8 billion barrels of oil as a consequence of lifting that ban. We see roughly an increase on an annual basis of 48,000 jobs as a consequence of this. And we've helped to rebalance the trade deficit in our favor by $178 billion.
Yeah, and these are all, to have a successful economy. And of course, with government spending, we spent trillions of dollars on this of late. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Mr. Menezes, I wanted to take up the remainder of Mr. Allen's time. Did you already clamp it down? Okay, I'll do it later. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let me get my mic over here. I want to ask and direct my attention to Dr. Hausker. So tomorrow begins the COP28 climate conference, and I know that their goal is to actually triple the investment in renewable energy and capacity and by 2030, which we've certainly talked about as a goal. But it seems to me that that is doable if you talked about the challenges that we have, if we are up to actually doing that. And I know that there are some things that are barriers in the way. For example, we have to do some streamlining of the permitting process. We should do more when it comes to investing in transmission, those kinds of things. But I'm wondering what you think are the most important steps that we need to take right now. What are the kinds of barriers that we have to knock down? What are some of the most important investments? I know you've talked about the three things, the three bills that we have passed already. But going forward, what are the most important steps that we need to take?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks for that question. You touched on permitting, and again, I think that is something that I think all four witnesses have touched on, that there's bipartisan support for improving our permitting system, maintaining protections, but making things faster and eliminating duplication and needless delay. And we need that permitting reform for transmission lines, for various kinds of pipelines, and for basically clean energy projects of all types, whether it's renewables small modular nuclear or what have you. So permitting is extremely important. I think moving forward on the intelligent, smart, flexible regulation in certain transportation applications and in industry, we mentioned DOE appliance regulation, all that would be extremely important to move forward and hopefully not be endlessly challenged in court or struck down because of, I think, very short-sighted Supreme Court principles that seem to be bouncing around on regulation these days. Those are the ones that come to mind. But I also want to second something that my colleague said about problems in the bid-based markets, or another way to say that is the restructured markets, or we have regional transmission organizations. He put his finger on a problem of how the markets are not designed to accommodate large projects or risky projects or perceived financial or technological risk, and yet we need to move forward in those markets as well as our traditional vertically integrated markets. So we need to rethink market design, in my view, in those areas.
Thank you. Yes or no, you think this is doable, however, right?
As I said, it's challenging to do the clean energy transition as I've described and as laid out in various scenarios. And there are going to be,
Well, I'm running out of time. Let me ask you one more question. You've mentioned the three bills, the infrastructure reduction, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. And I know that you had in your testimony some talk about jobs that are created. I wanted to focus a bit on that because I think that's so important for the American people now. The impact of these bills that got passed and the what it means when we go to renewables and job creation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Often clean energy solutions are going to be more capital intensive and less fuel intensive, and also more labor intensive for the construction and the operation. So I think we're going to largely see employment benefits in this shift. And as my testimony, I noted a group led by former Energy Secretary Menezes estimated that we could create an additional 1.5 million jobs by 2030 by fully implementing the provisions of these three bills.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. My first question is going to be for Ms. Eversole, and thank you for being here. We've discussed the many environmental benefits from the switch to clean American natural gas. As a result of the shale revolution, America is the global leader in exporting LNG and emission reductions. Beyond strengthening our national security and the corresponding environment benefits, the shale revolution has been a game changer for local communities and areas like southeastern Ohio. Just a few weeks ago, the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District, which covers most of my and Chairman Johnson's district, released a report showing revenues from Utica shale leases have bolstered the region's economy by nearly $1 billion. These leases have allowed the district to invest in upgraded recreation and camping facilities, new conservation programs, efforts to improve water quality, and have supported thousands of new jobs. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this report for the record. Thank you. Ms. Eversole, can you discuss the efforts that API's member companies have taken to be responsible stewards of the environment and investments they've made in local communities and where they operate?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question, Congressman. And I think that there are more than 8,000 jobs directly from our member companies in your district, and that doesn't take into account all the other jobs and through small businesses and restaurants and local retail that thrives as a consequence of having that level of investment and good wages in the district. It's extremely important. We've talked about the energy trilemma, but the impact, the real world impact on the ground and you get to see it every day that you're home is significant. We care deeply about the environment and we care about conservation. You know, we've talked about hydraulic fracturing. That alone has allowed this industry to reduce our surface footprint by 70%. That means that the campgrounds that you talk about, that means that the land is there for folks to enjoy, and it's really it's a pleasure to be able to serve the people of your district, sir.
Well, thank you, and we are proud, and I should mention that Craig Butler leads the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District, and he has done a fantastic job, has a understanding of what this is and the importance of, putting it back in. Follow-up, Mr. Eversole, this committee has outlined concerns with various policies from the current administration that threaten grid reliability, hurt domestic producers, and will increase energy costs for consumers. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on past policies that have encouraged private sector innovation. Can you discuss a few things? Excuse me, can you discuss a few times you think states or Washington, D.C. has gotten things right? And then a follow-up to that would be, and how can this committee work to strengthen pro-growth policies moving forward?
Right. Innovation is one of those things where, we have been the envy in the world across so many different areas, including in this industry. And innovation is very hard to regulate. Right? The private sector has a key role here. Of course, we support sensible regulation, efficient and effective regulation. But I do think that it really comes as a consequence of a partnership between the public and private sector. And it gets back to really the shared goals. Our shared goals should be to figure out how to produce more American energy for the benefit of our people, ensuring that it's affordable, reliable, and cleaner energy. And that's very important to the industry. It's very important to what we'll pursue going forward. Heavy-handed mandates like what we're seeing by EPA's tailpipe regulation, for example, it's the wrong way. There's a right way and a wrong way to consider regulation. And I'm encouraged by some of the bipartisan discussions that we've had here today, but there's a lot more to do, because what we haven't talked about today is that this isn't an either or. This is not about fuel switching. This is about a massive increase in energy demand globally, 35% over the coming decades, more energy. This isn't about either or. This is about addition, and we look forward to meeting those energy demands.
Thank you so much for that response. It was very well done. I'm going to try this, Mr. Menezes. I hope I don't cut you short, but I will be cautious of my time. I'll run out of time. I better not. So I apologize. Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now I yield to my friend from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the panel for your testimony today. A number of you have, at least Mr. Mills and Mr. Menezes, talked about small modular nuclear. And that's something that's of interest to me in particular. Idaho National Lab is in my state and is a source of information and a lot of work on the small nuclear reactors. And I wanted to just address a question to Mr. Mills with this backdrop. Internally, we've likened the potential of the small modular nuclear reactor kind of like what the Boeing 727 was to the aviation industry. It kind of revolutionized it, provided service to smaller regions, smaller airports. And it seems like the small modular nuclear reactor could be the same for energy. Yet our current federal promises to COP, the Climate Change Conference, and administration timelines are really driving some windows and constraints on this that skew the priorities for the development of these technologies. And I just wanted to, first of all, Mr. Mills, get your input on two things. Number one, do you see the parallel that I just described with what the potential of the small modular nuclear reactor could be, number one? Number two, are we putting artificial timelines, are we prioritizing those incorrectly for development?
Well, I think, this is pretty clear from my testimony, I think the priorities are incorrect, and the priorities require putting as a primacy costs and ultimate costs to consumers, As far as nuclear energy is concerned, I think the biggest challenge is a failure to recognize, again, the timelines. One has to be more patient than current laws and regulations would imagine it will take to build new generation, new class of nuclear power plants. You have to build them first. We've not built any of them at scale. Have to operate them for a number of years to see how they work and how you build more of them. There's 72 different designs for small reactors in the world. Probably 70 of them will work technically. If I were guessing today, a couple dozen will be economically feasible, but we won't know that for at least a half dozen years. Might be 10 years.
So on a related note, I'm just going to stay with you just for a moment. Uranium is something that's necessary for this development. And my understanding is 24% of our supply is currently dependent upon Russia, which for one makes me nervous. Is there a reason why the administration has not put more emphasis on sourcing uranium domestically? We've got it in multiple places right here in the U.S.
The uranium mining and refining and enrichment processes, all of which are critical for nuclear fuel and then fuel production, are central to the future of nuclear power. We made some epic mistakes in those domains in legislation over the last couple decades, and I don't see efforts commensurate with the challenge yet.
Nor do I, and I thank you for that, Mr. Mills. I'm going to shift gears. I'd like to talk to Mr. Menezes just for a second. Another interest in my home state of Idaho has to do with geothermal. And that's, we're a pioneer in that. We've currently got more than 70 direct-use geothermal sites. Our state capital has been powered by geothermal, or at least has used geothermal energy dating back to 1892. That's not 1992, but 1892. And so I try to promote this as much as I can just because of what I believe are the benefits to that. I'd like to ask you, do you see an opportunity for the U.S. to become a leader on a global basis here? Just talk to that for a moment, if you would.
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely. I mean, geothermal is there right in plain view, if you will, for us to actually to develop and to deploy. This has been an area of priority, obviously in Idaho, and with the National Lab, Department of Energy has also elevated this as a great opportunity right here in the United States to develop this technology. It needs to be economical. You know, there's some physics that need to be applied to it, but it's an abundant source. We have plenty of places in the United States where we can do this. We do need to get the permitting in place so that we can go forward on this, but it's a plentiful source, and it's one that we should be looking at very closely.
Thank you for that. And I'm about out of time, but I want to take the last few seconds rather than ask a question. I've got plenty more questions, but just to make a note, too, for the record, hydro in the Pacific Northwest is also a very reliable, inexpensive, efficient baseload. And I think that it's suffering some of the same discrimination in terms of priority, certainly within our region of the country, as perhaps some of the nuclear or even geothermal energy sources are. So with that, I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fulcher. Now I yield 5 minutes to Mrs. Miller Meeks from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank all of our witnesses here today. As you've already heard, the United States is a leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all while increasing energy production. Extremely important point. We have reduced emissions and increased production. Since 2005, the United States has reduced net greenhouse gas emissions by 17%, and this reduction occurred while primary energy production in the country increased by 48%. Even at COP, which I went to in 21, 22, and will be going in another several weeks, it is widely acknowledged that energy demand is not going down, and in fact, it is going up, if not doubling, over the next decade. I'm proud to say in Iowa that the state that I represent has slashed its carbon intensity from electricity generation more than any other state between 2000 and 2020. My home state generates nearly 2/3 of total electricity net generation from renewable sources, including over 60% from wind energy. Additionally, Iowa produces more fuel ethanol and biodiesel than any other state in the union. Meanwhile, China emits more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire developed world combined. In fact, China's carbon emissions increased this year by 4% in the first quarter of this year reaching the highest first quarter number on record, which is why it's problematic that the Biden administration is continually turning to the Chinese Communist Party to produce energy components. Meanwhile, they increase coal-produced energy. Additionally, America's air quality also surpasses the rest of the world. I remember growing up as a child that we were going to die of acid rain. We couldn't fish in the river. If you fished, you couldn't eat the fish because of mercury, and air pollution was a cause of asthma. U.S. levels of fine particulate matter are far lower than the world average and lower than Europe and Southeast Asia. In fact, the United States manufacturing industries are often environmentally cleaner than the global average. If environmental regulations on particulate matter currently being pursued by the EPA are put into place, this could have unintended effects of increasing greenhouse gas emissions and criteria pollutants by having to rely on products manufactured overseas. Mr. Menezes, how does the Biden administration's tunnel vision on an electric vehicle-only future jeopardize U.S. energy security?
Well, thank you for the question, I think. Well, what we have been discussing here is that the people are not going to necessarily choose that there's going to be a one option for them. So they're going to want options. And so if you put all your eggs in one basket, you are probably going to get some pushback. And so I would just say that you need to keep a broad view. There's going to be many component parts of trying to get to reduce emissions in the transportation space. We have talked about today the transportation sector now, leads, if you will, in emissions over the power sector, where we've gotten tremendous drops. So, but it'll be the consumer that's going to be driving these choices. I think all consumers, wish to produce less emissions, but whether or not you're going to be forced to buy an electric vehicle is something to
Does it put the U.S. at a disadvantage, more to my point, when component parts, battery parts, minerals are developed, processed, mined, refined overseas coming into the United States?
Yes, indeed, particularly with the EVs, because we know China produces all the parts. And by embracing, EVs, it's China that leads the world in producing EVs. And so you see pushback in Europe, Germany, for example. The internal combustion companies of Mercedes-Benz and Porsche, they are pushing back on Europe's attempts to go to 100% or zero emission vehicles. They do not want to give up the global leadership in those technologies, nor do the U.S. manufacturers of these automobiles. And so I see China is sitting there. They cannot compete in the internal combustion engine automobiles. They dominate electric vehicles, so why wouldn't they support a global push for electric vehicles?
Thank you, and I say that as having owned two Honda Civic hybrids, which my hybrid was an excellent blend between the two. Mr. Mills, can you discuss the important role U.S. manufacturing plays in reducing global emissions?
Well, the U.S. manufacturing sector is obviously central to prosperity. Germany is a manufacturing giant, as is China. Germany is in danger of deindustrializing. It's been widely covered now because of their energy policies, not because of environmental policy, but because of energy policies. The United States would follow Germany's path now, apparently, which is be destructive to our industry, and therefore destructive to general environmental goals, because the manufacturing will occur in China and in India, which are expanding their coal production, and frankly, their environmental practices are substandard from our perspective, to put it politely.
Which then undermines the United States security and leads to great disruption. So thank you. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. What a great hearing. I represent the Permian Basin. The shale revolution that we talked about, has largely emanated from there. The innovation that we have all talked about that has lowered emissions. What really saddens me today is that I don't know that there's any other way to look at it but to think that my colleagues who talk about this narrative, polluters over people, actually just hate American companies. And that just saddens me. They hate American innovation because they haven't proven anything else. That's the only way to look at it. We're doing more of everything, more production, more building, more of everything, and yet less emissions, less harmful toxins, less particulate matter, less methane intensity, less CO2, less. And the facts are there, and yet they still demonize American companies, and that's really sad to me. Let's talk about the methane emission reduction program, which my colleagues said that they talked to industry about, yet the industry that I represent in the Permian Basin, not a single person out there was consulted on this. Nobody was consulted on what this tax looks like. The ultimate goal was just to produce less, to tax it so they would produce less. I'll start with Mr. Menezes. Talk to us about private sector innovation, reducing emissions, and the threat if we do the MERP, if that goes into effect, what's the effect going to have on emissions ultimately?
We talked about the innovation on emission reductions. With respect to your comments about methane, methane is not defined as a pollutant because we know that natural gas is actually an energy source. So it's not actually defined as a pollutant, although it's now cast as a pollutant. And indeed, it does have repercussions on emissions along with CO2. However, if you look today at the development of these new technologies to detect, to measure, monitor, and reduce methane emissions, it's all private sector. In some respects, when you look at what EPA is now representing, they have to acknowledge now that the industry, these are industries that is leading this. So if the government just lets the industry continue, remember, this is a product. They have an interest in making sure that leaks that now they can detect, they're going to capture and they're going to use. So it works that way. You don't have to look at regulation every time as a solution. In fact, at the department, when I was at the department, we had a saying, it was innovation over regulation.
So let's take that innovation, Ms. Eversole. Talk to me about the 600 companies that you represent and their desire to capture it just for financial interest.
Right. As Mr. Menzies said, this is our product. Methane is our product. It is in not only our financial interest to capture it and sell it, it's also in our interest in serving our communities and our employees. I think it's very important. We've talked about the 66% reduction in methane emissions. That's not because we had a heavy-handed approach like the MERP program. It's because of the American ingenuity represented by the member companies, many of whom operate in your district. But that 66% reduction across all 7 major U.S. producing basins came at the same time as an increase in production of 179%. We can do both. It's a false choice that we have to pick either or. And it's in our interest to do it, and the industry is going to keep at it.
The implementation of Subpart W and through the Clean Air Act is an ill thought of and very harmful policy that will harm our national security, that will harm our economic security. Mr. Hausker, thank you for being here. What city would you recommend in the United States that we try the experiment of going solely to unreliable forms of energy? And I'm talking renewables here. Which city should we try this on? I noticed at the back, and maybe he's still wearing a jacket, but when we first got in here, anybody notice it was a little bit cold in this room? Which city would you recommend in the United States that we try the experiment of no natural gas, no coal, no nuclear, nuclear if you want, if we can get it passed, but
I wouldn't recommend that experiment for any city, and I don't think in my testimony or anyone trying to solve the climate problem has recommended that we go to totally unreliable sources.
Mr. Hausker, the policy of going to 50% EVs is exactly doing that. Because where is that electricity going to come from when we've propped up through the IRA, the IIJA, and other policies in the last 2 years, when the Secretary of Energy says that China is leading the way on green policies and green energy? I think we are. I think that's been suggested that we go that direction.
Mm-hmm. I think EVs can grow and we can maintain adequate power supplies through a mixture of renewables, nuclear, and some carbon capture on some fossil plants. The IRA, as I said earlier, provides technology-neutral incentives for all zero-carbon electricity. So I don't think we're going to carry out the experiment that you've hypothesized.
My time has expired. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Crenshaw, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. We'll state some key facts, I think, that are important to start this discussion. Key fact number one, energy demand will go up 50% or so in the next few decades by 2050. Energy demand will go up. Another key fact, the primary reason that emissions in the US have gone down is because of fracking. It's because of our natural gas revolution, which emits maybe half the CO2 of coal. And it wasn't a bunch of environmental activists that pursued that goal. It was our oil and gas industry that pursued that goal. It was not environmental regulations that made that fact happen, but it is a fact nevertheless. And so we find ourselves with the ultimate question, as we always do, which is costs and benefits. That's the question we have to answer. What is the cost to this action, and what are the actual benefits of it? If we all agree on the scientific consensus, which we'll say is the IPCC report, that there is warming going on, it's related to carbon emissions, and there's some interest in mitigating that. But I gotta say, the alarmist view of this question has been wholly debunked. It has been wholly and completely debunked. And I'm not saying that any of our witnesses are even implying that it's true, but it's worth stating that as a fact. And so when we look at cost benefits, we have to look at what's the value? Is there an inherent value in renewables? Does it just make us feel good? Is it almost like a religious obsession? Or is there an actual value? And that value might be measured by costs and benefits. How much does it cost to implement this technology? And what are the benefits we derive from it? And this is where I think we run into problems and disagreements certainly with our colleagues here. So I want to start with Mr. Hausker. Here's a basic question that I think people have a right to ask. What's the point of the U.S. diminishing our emissions by some of the goals set out by this administration, which are enormously costly? What's the point of it if the facts are, if we stopped emitting tomorrow, by the year 2100, it would have potentially a change in global temperature by 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So, a very insignificant benefit to an enormous cost. Now, that's a crazy cost. That's if we stopped emitting tomorrow. But what's the point of doing that when countries like China are building more coal capacity every single day and have no intention of stopping?
As I said earlier, no one country has created the climate change problem, and no one country can solve it. If I could wave a magic wand and eliminate China's emissions entirely, we would still have a problem. Eliminate US emissions, as you hypothesized, we would still have a problem, or India's, or any country. So this is a challenging problem of collective action across nations with only a few precedents, like how we phased out ozone-depleting chemicals.
And so it begs the question, like, what would that magic wand be? Since we don't have magic wands, but we do have policy levers. And so what would that be? Mm-hmm. And I can't help but go back to the obvious, which is, well, you would hopefully replace their coal furnaces with natural gas furnaces. That's what you would hopefully do, and you'd halve the emissions. Now, how would you do that? That's a separate question, perhaps, for diplomats and U.S. trade representatives and deals made at the highest levels. But if we're thinking just logically about how to actually reduce emissions, since that's supposedly our entire goal, why aren't we all in agreement on that, on exporting more natural gas to dirty coal-burning countries?
Why are we not in agreement?
Yeah, are we not in agreement? Maybe we are.
I think, as Ms. Eversole said, the export of LNG by the United States has had all sorts of positive impacts for Europe adjusting gas supplies in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion, and to the extent that our gas exports can replace coal, that's going to have a positive effect on global emissions.
Yeah, it certainly would, and I think we can export a lot more. Last question here. We have to talk about costs of renewables, and I don't think the costs of renewables have ever been, until recently, I think, accurately defined. But truthfully, what we're talking about is, a needed land, 10 times more land needed for solar and wind power for the same unit of energy than, say, gas and coal and nuclear. Basically unrecyclable materials. 90% of solar panels aren't recycled. It would take a ton of heat to recycle them, which of course would produce more carbon emissions, because I don't think you can get that heat from solar and wind power. And so you've got this real problem. How do you take that into account when assessing the costs and benefits of pushing heavily and subsidizing heavily renewables?
Well, first of all, again, just to be sure, we are moving away from merely subsidizing renewables to providing tax incentives for all zero-carbon electricity. I think that's a move in the right direction. Second, the cost of wind and solar has come down dramatically, I think as someone observed earlier today, but we know we can't push to 100% renewable power, and this is something that is clear in all the credible studies. So we have a state like Iowa, like Mrs. Miller-Meeks described recently, where she's at 60% wind in her state. That's great, but it needs to be complemented also with clean, dispatchable sources. And many of you have noted the need for dispatchable. So the grids of the future will be a mixture of solar, wind, nuclear, and clean dispatchable sources, and will hopefully keep the costs reasonable, affordable, and provide all the electricity we need.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Crenshaw yields, and now Mr. Duncan from South Carolina, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up on something Dan was saying, we need dispatchable, but when you have clean Power 2.0 regulations and the cost being passed on the utilities that on existing gas-fired power plants or new gas-fired power plants, the cost is almost prohibitive to the utilities putting that dispatchable online to supplement the wind and solar, as you talk about, Mr. Hausker. And the Democrats continue to thwart the pipeline infrastructure build-out that our country needs in order to deliver the natural gas you talk about for the countries like Vietnam to lower their carbon emissions by burning cleaner U.S.-produced natural gas. So, we've got to build out a pipeline infrastructure, produce here at home, deliver those resources not only to our utilities, but also to export facilities so we can export that to countries to help lower their carbon emissions. So don't thwart our efforts on building out a pipeline infrastructure, building more export terminals, and helping the globe while we do the geopolitical things that Dan was talking about at the highest levels, trying to get China and India and Vietnam and other places to take coal offline and use American-produced natural gas. So don't talk out of both sides of our mouth here. We like renewables on this side. It ought to be part of the matrix. It will be a part of the matrix, but we also have to have that dispatchable energy that you talk about. If we don't, we're going to have blackouts in this country. And that brings a point. Earlier today, Congresswoman DeGette said that, or she asked if the rush to green policies are hurting the economy. And you responded, they're not. Well, guess what? Utility rates are increasing. Transportation fuels are higher now than they were in the last administration. Just over the last 3 to 4 years, they've increased for my constituents and all of our constituents. Cost from the trucking companies are being passed on to the consumer through higher consumer goods. That's inflation. And we have subsidies, government spending, when we're borrowing that money, and ultimately that's going to have to be paid back. That's higher spending and higher taxes for my constituents. Maybe not today, but it's going to happen because every time we hear the president open his mouth, he wants more money. He wants more taxes to spend more money. It's crazy. The misnamed Inflation Reduction Act actually did nothing to reduce inflation, actually drove inflation higher because of the things I talked about. Consumers are paying more on the shelf, whether it's for groceries or things they purchase at a retailer, they're paying more because of the transportation costs, because the utility costs have increased under this administration because of this rush to green policy. So I disagree with you. It is hurting the economy because it's hurting my constituents. They're paying more at the pump for gas. They're paying more for natural gas that comes to their home, for their dryers and their hot water heaters and other things. They're now going to have to pay more for the appliances because they want to do away with gas-fired power appliances and use electricity. That's going to drive electricity cost up. Then you plug in your EV, you're going to pay more for electricity for your EV. It all trickles down to hurt the economy and the manufacturers I haven't even talked about that are having to raise prices because it's costing them more just to manufacture the things that they produce, the widgets they produce. In both this subcommittee and the Energy Subcommittee, which I chair, we've heard from FERC commissioners, grid operators, industry experts that the rush to green policies, subsidizing renewables, and unlawful EPA regulations, as I mentioned earlier, like Clean Power Plan 2.0, are contributing to premature retirements of reliable generation. We talked about that. But we've seen nuclear power taken offline in places like California, even places like Germany. We see higher natural gas prices. This is creating an overwhelming risk of blackouts in this country, and that will hurt the economy. It'll hurt families. It'll put people at risk in cold environments and hot environments depending on when the blackouts happen. So I want to circle back, Mr. Menezes, and I'm going to ask Mr. Mills this. Do these Russia Green policies threaten grid reliability, and does this increase the risk of blackouts?
I think the committee should be aware of NERC, the North American Energy Reliability Corporation, that has done studies on looking at, as we bring more and more renewables onto the grid that are inverter-based, that we have to look carefully at getting too far out over a power that can come on to ramp up and down. So on that question in particular, I think that you should look at the NERC studies.
Yeah, we've had NERC here, and they've mentioned that. We've had FERC here. We have had NRC here, at least in my subcommittee. Mr. Mills, I'll ask you a little different way. Is this hurting the standard of living and quality of life of Americans?
The short answer is yes. In every European country and U.S. state, the increased penetration of wind and solar on grids is associated with higher electric rates, not lower electric rates. The integration challenge and the real costs are higher than is billed, in the sense it's cheaper. It's not, in fact, operationally cheaper.
Well, I'll tell you this, as we retire generation and we don't replace that generation with dispatchable generation at equal or higher capacity, we're going to run into problems. My state's growing. I don't know about the rest of the country, but South Carolina's growing. And we have got to meet that growth by having dispatchable energy as part of our matrix. 8%, 9% of our power comes from solar, starts at 0 every day and ends at 0, and we don't have the storage capacity. We need dispatchable energy or we're going to have problems in this country. And so hopefully this committee and government in general will work on making sure Americans have always on, 24/7, 365 available power for our manufacturing, our municipalities, and our residential growth. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Duncan yields. Ms. Dingell from Michigan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ahead of the COP28 summit, we're here today to discuss how we as a country can stay a leader in reducing global climate emissions. It's vital that we and the rest of the world secure a sustainable energy future. Not only is this important for our energy security, but for our public health and global climate. Climate change is one of the most defining challenges of our time, and the scientific evidence of human-induced climate change is overwhelming. We're seeing it everywhere, every day. Left unchecked, climate change will lead and is leading to dramatic and irreparable damage to our environment, our national security, and natural resources. And that's why it's critical for the United States to lead the world by example during this transition to renewables and clean energy. Though the transition to renewable and clean energy is necessary for our future, the reality is, and this is what you've heard my colleagues talked about, are scared. Most Americans are scared that clean energy is not reliable, and no one wants to worry about whether or not their energy sources will be able to properly heat their homes. Question that was being asked when he said, what city? But Dr. Hausker, can you talk about how the Inflation Reduction Act increases our energy security by increasing our production of domestic energy and decreasing our reliance on fossil energy sources?
Mm-hmm. Is that addressed to
you?
Yes. Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act, with its set of incentives, induces more energy, clean energy forms of all types. So we're not reliant on solely just increasing solar or just increasing wind. As I said, new plants, if there's zero carbon electricity, they all get an incentive. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is that for the first time, the IRA created an incentive for existing nuclear plants to continue operation, particularly in the bid-based deregulated markets that I mentioned earlier. Those plants are under a lot of economic pressure. So for the first time, there's a national policy to support the continued operation of nuclear power plants. That's a plus also. We also are launching really a hydrogen industry with the IRA. Up till now, industry has produced a little bit of hydrogen for some niche uses, but now we have a set of tax incentives to really launch it as a major energy source for the future. And again, improves our security.
Thank you for that. Here at home, we're taking proactive steps to transition to renewable energy, from clean energy manufacturing to investing in the domestic production of electric vehicles. We've got to do it in a way that we make sure that that's a success with batteries and solar panels. But Dr. Hausker, how do we ensure that the United States remains competitive and accelerates its transition to clean energy? And if we sit back and do nothing, what is the danger of letting countries like China lead, which I am never going to let them do?
Yeah, we need to be smart and strategic in all of our policies, in our trade policies, in our tariffs, in negotiation of trade pacts, on top of our climate and clean energy policies. They are all woven together, and I'm very impressed with the leadership that the Biden administration has shown in enhancing domestic capabilities and in managing the relationship with China.
Historically, innovation and development of new technologies has been critical to reducing pollution and cleaning up our environment. Remember what our air was like and our water was like in the 60s. And just for the record, John Dingell got widely denounced when he wanted to clean up the water. He was an enemy. I went in and found him. And now can you imagine today, people saying, let them drink dirty water? But Dr. Hausker, how has innovation helped us to make progress in addressing the climate crisis? And how important will future investments in clean technology be to achieving our ambitious goals?
We had some good discussions on that today, and I think everyone agrees that innovation is the key to solving so many problems, including our environmental problems. Business innovates on its own when it serves private customer needs. That's why we have the iPhone. That's why we have all sorts of innovation. But if we need innovation to solve a public problem, like an environmental problem, we need the policy framework first to drive the innovation. And if that policy framework is flexible and performance-based, business responds with great innovation and great new technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mrs. Dingell yields. Now I recognize my good friend from Utah, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So call me Pollyannish, but I like to find the areas where we actually agree, and despite what you hear in the press and throughout the world, I think there's actually a lot that we agree on this issue. And I'd like to just point out something that I've heard as a theme this morning, and I'm going to articulate it in a slightly different way. And that is affordability matters, right? When you make these decisions, it matters. Reliability matters, and if you don't watch that, it matters. But clean matters, right? And I think it's been a mistake historically to only talk about affordability and reliability and ignore clean. And I think it's been a mistake to talk about clean and ignore affordability and reliability. And in an oversimplistic way, I think Europe went down a path of clean only, and clean mattered far more than affordability and reliability. And I would just say, I think I've heard on both sides of the aisle today a lot about these three factors. And if I could be king for a day, I would say, look, our goal for 2050 is affordable, reliable, clean, go, right? Let this innovation go. We can get there, and I actually think we can. I'm also, Mr. Hausker, I'll compliment you because I've heard, at least in innuendos, that it's not about fossil fuels, it's about emissions. And I think that that's a mistake that we make sometimes. I represent oil, gas, and coal in my district. And if I talk to them about the evils of fossil fuels, I lose them, right? And they're gone, and they want to push back and fight. If I talk to them about affordable, reliable, clean, they say, we're on it, right? We get it, we understand it, and we'll innovate, and we'll find our path there. And as we talk about Mr. Mills' energy transition, I regret that sometimes we talk about fossil fuels as if we have to transition them out. And I just want to be clear, no, we have to transition emissions out. And every source of energy has what I would call a fatal flaw. In renewables, it's storage, right? I think we'll get there, but today that's a fatal flaw for renewables. For nuclear, I love nuclear, but it's cost, and I think we'll get there, but today it's cost and timing. And for fossil fuels, you've got this issues of emissions, and I think with carbon sequestration, direct air capture, and if you talk to everybody that I know in the fossil fuel industry, they'll commit to a net neutral by 2050. So I think it's important that we
include them as part of the solution and not part of the problem. Now, given that, I also want to highlight something I think that we've heard today, and I think it's the theme of the hearing, and that the U.S. has led in this innovation. And I think some of the problems sometimes with this debate is that we don't celebrate our successes. We feel like we have so far to go that we can't stop and celebrate our successes. And I think it's important to stop and say, hey, we've done a lot of really good things here in the United States, and we shouldn't be bashful about that on the world leadership platform. We should herald our successes and not hide them. And I actually think that in all the major sectors, we lead in cleanliness around the world. And not perfectly, but in a lot of sectors. And I want to refer to a study that's been done by the Climate Leadership Council. As a matter of fact, I asked unanimous consent to put it into the record. Some of you will be familiar with this.
Without objection.
Thank you. And so I'm grateful to the Climate Leadership Council for doing this, but the problem with that is it's an outside third party. It's not a government document. And I actually think that there's some things coming at us, the CBOM from Europe and things like that, where it's going to be important for us to say from the Department of Energy, this is what we're doing. So I'm pleased with Representative Peters to be working on what we call the Prove It Act, which would be a government study that would actually demonstrate in all of these sectors where we are leading, maybe where we're weak in a couple of areas, but where we're leading, so that we have actual facts when we're sitting with China and talking about the discrepancy that we're putting on U.S. businesses. And when the CBAM is put into effect, we're not using Europe's numbers, we're using our numbers. So, Ms. Eversole, you're nodding. Let me have you comment on that. And Mr., and I'm not going to pronounce it right, would you follow up with just like, is DOE up for this task? And but go ahead.
Right. I'll start by saying we appreciate your leadership. We supported the Prove It Act in the Senate, and we think it makes a lot of good sense to study, have the Department of Energy study the energy intensity levels. I do think that there is a right way and a wrong way of how we should consider very complex carbon border adjustment mechanisms. It's worth making sure that we, to the points earlier made, understand the unintended consequences,
Correct.
Perhaps, but thank you for your leadership, sir.
Yes.
I mean, DOE has its policies in place to where it is looking at truly all of the above. I mean, they have offices looking at all the things that you.
Yeah, but I wanted to just specifically comment on, are you up to a study, if we can get this passed, would this be a good thing for DOE, and are you up to the task of doing this study?
Well, I'm not representing DOE here, I'm representing USEA. However, we do have relationships with DOE, and I'm happy to talk to DOE about.
Thank you,
taking up the study.
Yeah, I also want to just, in the 17 seconds I have left, I want to point out, not only is America business dealing with this discrepancy in our standards for emissions that put a lot of additional cost on, but we're also dealing with human rights differences, where there's a lot of variables that are not equal once things are coming to the United States. And Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, for letting me be here today, and the witnesses for being here. As my friend Congressman Curtis just said, affordability matters. So I'd like to kind of go off balance sheet here a little bit and focus my remarks on the so-called eRINs program being pushed by this administration. While the program is being portrayed as a way to drive electric vehicle integration, this is nothing more than a subsidy to EV manufacturers and an attempt to destroy the existing liquid fuels market. Instead of generating RINs at the point of blending, this proposal creates a convoluted process to award credits to the car manufacturers and other third-party participants like chargers and charging stations. Having spent my career buying and selling RINs, I'm keenly aware of how a complicated process like the one proposed by EPA could become rife with fraud and abuse like the very beginning of the RIN program. Even more, I fear buying obligations for eRINs would fall into existing liquid fuel refineries who could be forced to buy even more credits on top of the RINs that they may have to buy. The EPA's proposed rule to create eRINs for electric vehicles is a troubling proposal that extends far beyond the intent of the renewable fuel standard. The administration is looking to subsidize manufacturers in the EV chain to recoup their investments and make up for underwhelming sales. Instead of finding common sense solutions to lower emissions, such as being discussed by my colleagues today, the administration is taking one-size-fits-all approach to the transportation sector. Across the country and in my home state of Indiana, innovators are leading the way to develop new next-generation engines that can utilize a variety of fuels like Cummins Engine Company in my hometown, or Clear Flame in my hometown as well, trying to convert to ethanol in diesel engines. Ms. Eversole, as you know, the EPA has not committed to an additional proposed rule for e-RINs and could go straight to a final rule without additional input from the public. If the EPA implements a system outlined by the set rule from 2022, how would this disrupt the existing fuels market and the industry you represent?
Congressman, thank you very much for the question, and we appreciate your leadership on H.R. 4469. It was extremely important, passed part of the fuels package. And look, there's an all-out assault on liquid fuels in this country right now. We see it in the form of EV mandates. We see it all across the country. We see it in states like California. But at the core, we share the objectives of reducing emissions in the transportation sector. That's clear and straightforward. But the RFS is really not designed for this sort of objective. And ultimately, we don't believe that the concept of e-RINs is technology neutral. It is putting a thumb on the scale, so to speak, for the outcomes. We would rather see innovation driving, and you can look across our membership and see how we are, in the downstream in particular, making cleaner fuels. It was part of our objective in the API's climate action framework, and there's a lot of work to do. We just happen to believe there's a right way and a wrong way of doing so, and we don't think this administration's approach makes a lot of sense.
Do you think this is going to move forward at all, or do you think it's suspended at the moment?
We were supportive of EPA pulling out and separating the e-RIN program from the rest of the RFS set, and so hopefully they don't come back together.
So initially, I was very concerned that not only it depends on who you're representing, whether the smaller refiners or the bigger refiners, but would this be incremental requirements for smaller refiners?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and seeing no further members seeking to ask questions, I do have one final question, and with the indulgence of our ranking member, I'm going to ask that really quickly here. Mr. Menezes, I didn't get to this earlier. This committee recently heard testimony on the administration's Clean Power Plan 2.0, and witnesses expressed concerns that such heavy-handed top-down dictates disincentivize innovation and put our electric grid at risk. Can you discuss the importance of patience and a stable regulatory environment for the private sector in order to innovate while maintaining reliability and affordability?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. The industry is put in a place where they want to build facilities to help address emissions. The permitting process delays them, and then when they're unable to implement their own innovation, then regulation comes in. And as was just discussed, sometimes regulation comes out in the form of not getting sufficient public interest, but rather a final rule, and so it's implemented. So it is important that we need to put in place, as others have said, really reasoned policies in place so that innovation can both thrive and do it in a sense of urgency and yet not impose regulations which might have unintended consequences.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mills, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the timeline challenge is what's being ignored here, and the cost challenges. The technologies that exist today, and I'll quote Bill Gates on this, are not up to the challenge of the aspirations of any of the COP conferences or the IEA. And the technologies that are required, and I'll quote Gates again, because he's obviously an advocate of an energy transition, the technologies not only don't exist, but have, in his words, no predictor function, which is to say we're going to be suffering huge costs without knowing the outcomes. Finally, I'd just like to point out and again, this is Bill Gates recently after the last Davos meeting, none of the actions being taken will mitigate what's going to happen in the models that predict climate outcomes in the next 20 years. Therefore, money should be directed at resilience and mitigation in the environments where we have everything to agree on. That is, there is no downside to allocating capital to mitigation and resilience, except that the capital is limited.
Okay, thank you. With that, again, I'll yield to you, Ranking Member, if you have anything. Okay, all right, well, great. Well, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. Let me say to our panelists, thank you all so very much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here with us today. We appreciate that. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.